Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the renowned physician and professor, maintained a private practice and received patients at his home throughout the day. People came to him constantly, and now 2 visitors sat in his waiting room from the Committee on International Cultural Relations. Timothy Grayson, who held the position of deputy chairman, had come simply to support his friend, while the committee chairman and Timothy's friend, Congressman Richard Walters, waited for the doctor's help. "Gentlemen, I'm a respected public figure, Professor. What am I supposed to do now?" Richard shouted indignantly. "You can't just act like this. You need to control yourself. How old are you?" 43, Professor. "You understand that publicity will ruin me. In a few days, I'm supposed to receive a business trip to London." "Yes, I'm a lawyer, my dear fellow." "Well, wait a couple of years and marry her." "I'm already married, Professor." "Ah, gentlemen, Professor Whitmore pondered. Both visitors waited respectfully. From the adjacent room, a young man of very pleasant appearance emerged and glanced out. Smiling at the visitors, he said, "Professor Whitmore, forgive me, but could you come here? It's very important regarding that experiment." The professor left, closing the door firmly behind him, but fragments of conversation reached Richard's ears. "Illegal. Our department won't cover. Prison for abortion. Sentence." The rest became completely inaudible. After a couple of minutes, Professor Whitmore returned to the waiting room and firmly declared, "Forgive me, gentlemen, but I cannot help you with anything. The risk is too great, and I'm too old for this, even for double the fee." "What about triple?" asked Walters. "Even for triple. And what if I add this?" In the chairman's palm lay a gold watch encrusted with diamonds. For some time, the professor hesitated. Greed battled with caution within him, but the latter won, and Professor Whitmore erupted in an angry rebuke. "What am I, some petty shopkeeper that you thought to bargain with me? Bargain with me like at a market. Please leave immediately. I'll keep your visit secret, so be it, but I won't help. Leave the apartment now." The visitors had to comply. Exiting the professor's house onto the clean street, the friends walked toward Meridian Park. Winter Washington, covered in snow, was wonderfully beautiful, and the golden rays of the evening sun added softness and coziness. Citizens kept stopping and saying to each other, "Look at that beauty." But Richard noticed nothing around him. He was simply in despair. Professor Whitmore had been his last hope, and it had proven futile. The piquant adventure with the young pianist threatened to ruin everything. Soon Emily's pregnancy would become noticeable. Everything would be revealed, and there would be a tremendous scandal. His wife would throw him out, her relatives would demand the debt be returned, and he'd be immediately expelled from the committee and dragged through the courts. The newspapers would certainly write about it, especially the foreign ones. Such news from America was always loved abroad. "Oh, shame, shame." Walters clutched his head and groaned. His friend patted him on the shoulder. "You know, I've been thinking, Richard." Richard looked at Timothy hopefully. "It sounds like complete nonsense, but in Appalachian West Virginia, my great-aunt lives. Don't laugh, but she's a witch. Well, in every mountain hollow, there's some wise woman who heals with herbs and charms away illnesses. But people from all over the region used to run to my gray tant to hide their sin. She knows how to remove the fruit from the womb. Maybe you could take Emily to her, since all the Washington doctors are afraid. Where does this aunt live? A place called Hollow Creek. A sharp gust of wind pulled, and Richard buried his nose deeper into his scarf. What a telling name. This is your last chance. Otherwise, I'm finished. Don't give up, old man. I'll write a letter to my aunt, ask her to be gentler with you. Buy some gifts, tea, sugar, tobacco, sweets of all kinds, and take your pianist to the mountains. The journey from Washington to Hollow Creek went very smoothly. Even transportation wasn't a problem. The weather was wonderful, windless, and clear. The sun's rays on the snow made it sparkle with billions of sparkles, and everything around looked festive and cheerful. Walter's mood was excellent. Here, far from the capital, he could walk arm in arm with the young beauty, and not fear that his wife or gossiping acquaintances would see them. Peasant women have always somehow solved such questions from time immemorial, even without any metropolitan medical luminaries. Richard smiled to himself. Walking beside Emily, he was happy. The girl joyfully clung to his shoulder. She too was enjoying the journey, but sometimes, remembering its purpose, she would grow gloomy and sigh heavily. At such moments, Richard tried to cheer her up, and the girl, accustomed to relying on him in everything, would calm down. But near the village, Emily was again overcome with doubts. Tears glistened in her eyes, and she timidly whispered in his ear, "Richard, maybe we shouldn't. I feel sorry for the baby. We'll get married, won't we? You said so." Embracing the girl, Walters began patiently explaining that her parents wouldn't approve of such a gift to their 17-year-old daughter, that he couldn't divorce now or even arouse his wife's suspicions because of debts, because of his warm position on the committee, and in general, now was a very inappropriate time. Later, when everything was settled, Emily wiped away her tears and began looking around again. Meanwhile, the man turned the envelope with the letter over in his hands and thought about how Emily's belly was barely beginning to show and wasn't even visible under her thin dress yet. But her face had rounded slightly, and a special gleam had appeared in her eyes. This would be enough for an attentive person to understand everything. They needed to resolve the pregnancy issue as quickly as possible and distance Emily from himself. She had taken to whining and asking. What was all this talk about marriage? She should understand how life works. She's not little anymore, Richard thought irritably. What the girl was beginning to show were womanly traits he couldn't stand. Cunning, quarrelsomeness, and the ability to endlessly ask the same question without listening to the answer. How different from 2 years ago, when Richard first saw Emily at a performance of Young Talents before industrial workers. When she came out on stage and sat at the piano, Walter's heart stopped. It was passion, obsession, a lightning strike. The girl was so fragile, so attractive in her naive freshness, an almost childish hint of emerging womanhood. Her face and figure reminded Richard of a tight tulip bud covered in dewdrops. The bud still had to open, and with its untouched purity and mystery, it beckoned much more than already opened flowers. Walters had been very careful. He carefully inquired about the girl's family and arranged for her parents to be transferred from the suburbs to the capital for work. He found opportunities to communicate with Emily without causing gossip. At first, the girl avoided Richard and was shy around him, though she was flattered by the attention of a sophisticated man wearing a French tie and purple shoes. It took time for Emily to trust him completely, and then happy days began for Richard. He savored the nuances of happiness for a whole year, and then bang, pregnancy. Well, this door needed to be closed, and he needed to move on. Finally, Hollow Creek appeared. The witch's dwelling was located, as it should be, on the outskirts. The travelers had to walk through the entire village, past the community center with a banner bearing a patriotic slogan. And only at the very edge did Great Aunt Mabel's house appear, the most ordinary, unremarkable mountain house. Richard had already raised his hand to knock, but the door suddenly swung open. On the threshold stood the mistress, Aunt Mabel, dressed in a long skirt and worn leather jacket. A faded headscarf was tied in a knot at the back of her head. The woman wasn't young, but you couldn't call her an old crone either. She resembled a sea cliff from which time, wind, and salt had carved away all the soft rock, leaving only hard granite. So time had taken away the pretty beauty of youth from Mabel, but revealed a foundation breathing with power. Experienced federal agents would have envied the woman's gaze sharp, authoritative. It clawed into the soul with talons, and saw a person through and through with all their secret thoughts and desires. It made you want to hide or run far away. Emily blushed like a tomato and pulled her head into her shoulders. Richard felt uncomfortable, but endured the mistress's gaze, politely greeted her, and handed over the letter. Mabel unsealed the envelope, ran her eyes over the lines, and said, "Well, since my nephew asks, I'll help. Come in, we'll have tea and talk." Inside, the witch's house also looked ordinary: a wood stove, table, benches, shelves with dishes. Embroidered towels hung on the walls. The icon corner was empty, but the absence of icons no longer surprised anyone these days. Emily sat down on a bench and remained motionless. Richard gave the mistress gifts: tea, sugar, and tobacco. Mabel barely glanced at the brandy and candy, but was pleased with them. The samovar stood hot, as if the woman had been expecting guests since morning. She quickly set the table, and for some time they had an ordinary conversation about the weather and news. Then suddenly Mabel said, "Well, tell me what happened. Timothy wrote that you have special skills and can help with an extremely delicate matter. Don't beat around the bush, dear. My nephew said I'm a witch, and he's about right. I'm a knowing woman, that is, a wise woman. There are reforms in the yard, a new society, but here I am." Maybe she's joking flashed through Richard's mind. He peered into Mabel's face. The woman was completely serious. A chime sounded and everyone flinched. "Sorry, I didn't mean to," Emily whispered, lifting the lid of the sugar bowl. "Doesn't matter if it's nonsense or not, as long as the issue is resolved. Only you can help, Mabel. The thing is, our beloved had an accident. We gave in to passion, were careless, and now there's a little gift. We'd like to get rid of this, get rid of the pregnancy. Timothy said you can do this." "I can. It's a bad business, but that's for you to decide. And you, why are you silent?" Mabel arched an eyebrow and looked at Emily. "Have you thought it through well? You'll have to endure the pain, not him." Under the witch's gaze, the girl shrank completely. Biting her lip, she was silent for so long that Richard got scared. She'll refuse now, for sure. The brat will refuse, and that's the end of everything. But Emily quietly said, "I don't need this child." "Your choice," Mabel shrugged. So don't worry, my remedies are tested. But let's agree right away, you both obey me, don't argue, and don't ask questions. Clear? Emily squeaked yes. Richard nodded in agreement. Mabel slapped her palm on the table as if sealing the agreement and stood up. You'll stay here for the night. The girl needs to rest. I have another room with a bed over there. We'll go to the forest, you and I, sweetheart, and finish everything before dawn. More precisely, I will, but with your hands. That's how it must be. $30 up front. Wow, Richard whistled. To the forest? Why, it's winter, the ground is frozen. And what a price you're asking. Moscow professors, world-renowned specialists, do operations for 50, and you're demanding 30. Timothy asked in the letter to make it easier for you in honor of friendship. Well, friendship won't make you poor $30. You're not some mountain girl who has nothing but beads and ribbons. Going to the forest is the order, not established by us, and not for us to change. Don't like it. Get out, I didn't come to you. Embarrassed, Richard handed the witch the bills and apologized. She smirked contemptuously, took the money, and said, Let's go now and begin. Even Walters felt uneasy. Emily was trembling like an aspen leaf. But business is business, and Richard, picking up the girl in his arms, carried her to the room where the witch had just gone. Carefully setting Emily on the floor, Walters looked around. The room was brightly lit, candles burned everywhere. On the walls hung shelves, and on them reigned complete chaos. A mangy stuffed crow neighbored with books, bundles of herbs, and feathers. Various boxes were piled in an extremely unstable-looking pyramid. On one shelf lay a heap of miscellany, topped with an animal skull. Richard couldn't determine what kind. Under the window stood a bed. To the left of it, a table and stool roughly hewn from wood. In the corner, a chest covered with a wolf's skin. In the right corner stood a large boulder whose flat top was covered with scratches and dried stains. The stone was obviously used frequently. This is an altar, Richard realized. The scratches and traces, surely not blood. Above the altar hung a painting. Walters looked closer and froze, his mouth agape in surprise. The artist was a great master. The creature in the painting blended bear and human features so skillfully that you couldn't say where one ended and the other began, or which was more prominent, animal or human traits. The creature's face was female on the left, male on the right, and both halves flowed smoothly into each other. Below, they transformed into a bear's muzzle. The creature sat on a fallen tree, hands on knees, seemingly a calm pose, but power and menace were felt throughout the body. If it wanted, it would leap forward and attack. For the first time in his life, Richard felt his hair stand on end by itself. The creature in the picture evoked ancient animal fear and admiration. It was mesmerizing. You wanted to look at it like you're drawn to watch a thunderstorm or forest fire. Embodied power of the elements. Alien, rebellious, incomprehensible, but infinitely beautiful. Who is this? Asked Walters. Mabel pronounced one short but capacious word. Master. Is this some Slavic pagan god? You could say that. He has many names and forms, for he is the master. All right, enough chatter, to business. Both of you sit at the table. Striking a match, Mabel lit a red candle, placed it on the altar, put a piece of bread on it, and began quickly whispering something while looking at the bare man. Richard strained his hearing, but couldn't make out a single word. Then she deftly fished the right box from the pyramid and set it on the table. Here are fabric scraps and thread. You two must make a little doll from them. Look, Such dolls have been played with by peasant children since time immemorial. A body from fabric rolled into a tube and bent in half with a rag, and outstretched arms from another little rag tied crosswise. Take whatever you want, and when you're done, give the doll a name what you would have called your child. Say it like this: if it's a boy, I name you. If it's a girl, I name you. Say it out loud together. The guests set to work. It went poorly. Either the rag would unfold, or the thread would tangle, or the needle would get stuck. Richard sweated, Emily swallowed tears, but still, gradually, the work progressed. While the guests twirled over the doll, the witch went to the next room and rattled dishes there for a long time. She returned with a clay pitcher and mug in her hands. "Well, it's ready, it'll do," the witch said, examining the crooked doll. "Now the name, go ahead." After conferring, Richard and Emily said in half voices, "If you're a boy, I name you William. If you're a girl, I name you Grace. Now, sweetheart, take the doll and put it under your dress, right against your belly. That's right. Now drink the whole pitcher. This is the remedy." The guests leaned over the pitcher with apprehension. It was filled to the brim with dark liquid with a pleasant smell. "Drink, Emily. Everything will be fine," said Walters, pouring from the pitcher into the mug. With trembling hands, the girl took it and made the first sip, then a second, third. "Tasty? It's like fruit punch," said Emily, then immediately felt ashamed of her frivolous words. Soon the pitcher was empty. The girl put her hand on her lower belly. "Oh, something's pulling." "It's begun," Mabel said, laying Emily in bed and driving Walters out the door. "Wait there. You can walk around the yard or the street, just don't wag your tongue. If something comes up, I'll call you." Richard didn't know what to do with himself. He paced the room many times, examined the embroidery on the towels, found newspapers and a fresh issue of American Home magazine on a shelf, and carefully reread everything, but nothing eased the agonizing weight. From behind the door came screams and pitiful moans. Emily was in pain. Richard tried to enter the room, but Mabel wouldn't let him in each time. He felt helpless, and this made him even angrier. Cheap theatrics, candles, altars, monsters in pictures. Fine, the dark peasants, but I'm an educated man. How did I agree to this nonsense? And it's all Timothy's fault. Take your pianist to the mountains to see my aunt. People from all over the region come running. Well, what if Emily dies from her potion? What do I do then? Walters got dressed and went out to the yard. It had grown dark, and bright stars sparkled in the black sky, brighter than you'd see in the city. Richard walked around the house and tried to peek into the window of the second room, but it was covered with a thick curtain. Disappointed, he returned inside. In time, it became very quiet in the house. The door opened, and Mabel came out, holding a basin with some rags. She silently stepped aside, and the man rushed into the room. Inside, it smelled of blood, herbal smoke, and vomit. On the bed, in a terribly pale nightgown, lay Emily. Her eyes were closed, and her thin hand hung like a lifeless branch. "Emily," Walters knelt by the bed and took the girl's cold fingers. "Can you hear me?" Emily opened her eyes. She was very weak, but found strength to smile and say, "Richard, everything's fine. I'm no longer pregnant." Walters cried from relief. Finally, the danger had passed. Now everything would be as before, and even better. He wept, burying his face in the blanket, and Emily's weak hand stroked his head. "Sweetheart, come here," came Mabel's voice from the door. Wishing Emily a speedy recovery, the man went out. Mabel sat by the window, thoughtfully looking into the night. Tired, with disheveled hair, she now looked like an ordinary woman. Whatever she had done with Emily, it hadn't come easily to her either. Richard sat nearby. "How is she?" asked Walters. "She's bad now. Removing fruit from the womb isn't like going to a dance. She's young, she'll recover by morning." Gallantly kissing the witch's hand, Walters said, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my reputation, my career, and ultimately my life." "Cut the old-fashioned courtesies," Mabel frowned. "Let's go, the business isn't finished." "Where to?" "To the forest. I told you, you must bury the unborn child with your own hands before dawn. Otherwise, neither he nor people will have peace. He'll cause mischief, and you won't calm him down later." Walter saw a wooden tub in the corner. In it lay a lump of bloodied rags, and on top, that same little doll. "Maybe it's better to do it in the morning, or burn it in the stove rather than drag it to the forest. This contents isn't going anywhere." "Fool," Mabel flared up. "You don't understand anything, so at least don't argue with smart people. The order is what it is, and it's not for us to change. The spirit of this unborn child will detach from the body and wander by itself. He's underdeveloped, angry, and stupid, and without a body he can't develop. Over time, he'll transform into such a thing that you'll weep. Let's go. I've prepared everything. In the entrance hall, there's a sack and I'll take it. You take the tub and the shovel." "What nonsense, but it's easier to do than argue. Tomorrow we'll leave and I'll forget it all like a stupid dream," thought Richard. It was clear, and the moon generously flooded the area with silvery light. The night was quite warm, but Richard in his fashionable coat was freezing to the bone. However, he didn't complain and stubbornly followed the witch, who walked ahead with a lantern. Where they were going, he stopped understanding very quickly. All around was only darkness and pale birch trunks, all identical, and silence. Only the ominous creaking of branches, the sound of footsteps, and his own breathing disturbed it. The night forest frightened Walters to madness, but he looked only at the lantern's light and, gritting his teeth, walked forward. Finally, they stopped in a spacious clearing. Here, Mabel pointed with her finger. "Bury it at the roots of that birch, clear away the snow and make a fire. The ground will warm up and it'll be easier to dig. Come on, get moving. Can't you work with your hands?" Richard ignored the rudeness. Let her babble, it didn't matter, as long as they could return to warmth sooner. While the fire burned down, the man asked to pass the time, "Mabel, how did you get your abilities?" "By inheritance, but they taught me some things too. They say Tsar Ivan the Terrible ordered the execution of a powerful wizard back in the day. The knowledge came from ancient times, even before the founding fathers. The wizard, before his execution, passed his gift to one militiaman. That was my ancestor. Since then, someone in our family gets the abilities for witchcraft. Aren't you afraid the government will crack down on you? They don't approve of such things." Mabel's laughter flew through the frosty air. "I get along fine with the government. Witchcraft will exist under any power. People need this. Believe it or don't believe it, but we know how to heal, comfort, and help in every way. This is part of nature, that's all. Look, the fire's died down. Time to work." Walters began digging and soon warmed up. It was hard. The ground didn't want to yield even to the good German shovel that had appeared from who knows where with the mountain witch. "Put the rags in the hole," Mabel commanded, "and leave the doll. When you throw dirt on it, put it on top, then cover with snow. Looking at the bloody lump, Richard felt a disgusting mixture of guilt and revulsion. If it's a boy, then William. If it's a girl, then Grace, he remembered. It's a pity everything turned out this way. Richard placed the rag doll on the mound, covered everything with snow, and straightened up tiredly. Seems like everything's done right. Mabel shone her lantern on a branch, but she was nowhere to be seen. Mabel, what kind of jokes are these? Come back, where are you? Silence. Mabel, I'll give you $100. Hey, the same indifferent silence. His heart began pounding wildly. Richard bit his lip, trying to hold back panic. Maybe the wicked woman was just messing with him or had stepped away for a need. He'd gotten scared for nothing. He should wait. It seemed like an eternity had passed, but Mabel never appeared. Richard nearly lost his voice, but there was no answer to his desperate shouts. Apparently, she had abandoned him alone in the night forest. Never in his life had Walters been so frightened. Among the whitening tree trunks in the darkness, he imagined shadows and malicious gazes. Wolves and bears probably live here. They'll devour him before he reaches morning. Somewhere behind him, bushes suddenly crackled and snow crunched under someone's feet. Someone big, heavy, and unafraid of the forest was coming here. Richard grabbed the shovel and gripped it tighter. He'd leave, but bushes already swayed at the edge of the clearing, and the man raised the lantern higher, hoping the light would scare away the animal. No one emerged from the bushes, but tracks began appearing in the snow as if by magic. They headed straight for Walters. Panic overwhelmed Richard, and he threw the shovel and ran away. He rushed into the thicket without making out the road, stumbled and fell on all fours. The lantern flew into a snowdrift and went out. Now it'll devour me, flashed hopelessly through his mind. But all around was quiet, no branches cracked, no footsteps were heard. No one touched Richard or tried to eat him. He'd gotten lucky. Suddenly, the man realized that under his left palm something was lying. He took this object and pulled it from under the snow. A rag doll. How did it end up here? Looking closer, Richard understood this was a different doll. The rags and threads were different, and it looked old and faded. A terrible guess struck Walters, and he began rummaging in the snow. He found 5 more different dolls. These are graves. There's a whole cemetery here. Timothy said people from all over the region used to run to his aunt. Here lie all those, well, after abortions. Stop. Mabel said spirits remain without bodies, meaning they're also somewhere around here. Goosebumps ran down his spine. Richard jumped to his feet and threw the dolls into the snow. His heart beat as if it wanted to break through his chest from the inside. The feeling of danger was oppressive, and the forest silence literally pressed on his ears. In this silence, behind him came disgusting childish laughter. A child laughs like that when doing mischief and knowing that adults won't punish them. The sound right by his ear wouldn't have frightened Walters more. He cursed foully and turned around, expecting to see anyone from the devil himself to a government agent with a portable flamethrower. But he definitely didn't expect to see emptiness. Again, nothing and no one. Only snow glistening in the moonlight. Hey, I'm not afraid of you. Don't hide, show yourself, Richard shouted in a breaking voice. But the invisible mocker didn't appear. For some time, Richard stood painfully listening and peering into the forest, but everything was quiet. The man calmed down a bit. Maybe it seemed like it to me. I need to get back to the clearing and wait there. In the morning, I'll figure out how to get out of the forest. There should be a path, or at least our tracks with Mabel, as long as it doesn't snow and cover everything." He stood a bit more, gathering his resolve, then moved back along his tracks. Richard reached the clearing, parted the bushes, stepped into the open space, and cried out in surprise. In the middle of the clearing, with her back to him, stood Mabel. "Damn it," howled Richard. "Where did you disappear to?" "Where needed," the witch said calmly, not even turning around. "The master called." Indignant to the depths of his soul, Richard ran up to her, grabbed her shoulder, forced her to turn around, and screamed in horror at the sight of her face. He recoiled and, stumbling, fell on his back. Mabel's face was half human, half bare. She had become taller, and muscles bulged under the skin on her arms and legs. The tips of her fingers were crowned with black claws that any bear would envy. Mabel stepped forward and loomed over Richard. He covered himself with his hands, but how could that help? "Sorry, Washington man. Sometimes children and the master need to be fed. Besides, I didn't like you from the start." With one swipe of her clawed hand, the witch tore out the unfortunate man's throat. Blood gushed from the wound like a river. Richard convulsed and quickly went limp. Putting 2 fingers in her mouth, the witch whistled boldly like a bandit. A very attentive observer might have seen barely noticeable shadows in the moonlight. They flocked to Richard's body. "I hope my nephew won't guess, and if he understands, he won't be too angry with me," Mabel said thoughtfully. After all, the man was scum, and he was a congressman too. Oh yes, something for the master. She bent down and tore out the corpse's heart. Carefully wrapping it in a clean towel, Mabel put the bundle in her bag. Then she found the shovel and lantern, took them, and headed away from the forest. Behind her, a gentle whirlwind swept away the tracks. In the morning, a cobbler picked up Emily on the road far from Hollow Creek Village. She easily gave her name, age, and home address. But how she ended up in West Virginia, and what had happened in the last 2 days, the girl completely didn't remember. The kind cobbler took Emily to the county seat and handed her over to the police. They contacted their colleagues in the capital, and in a few days, the girl returned home to her parents. For the rest of her life, she never remembered what had happened to her. The disappearance of Congressman Richard Walters from the Committee on International Cultural Relations, just before his business trip to London, became a loud case. They searched for him long and thoroughly, but Richard vanished as if he'd sunk into water. No one thought that the body torn apart by a bear, found in summer in the West Virginia forest, was somehow connected to the congressman who had disappeared in winter. "Well, we're here. Here's the little house that's been hunched over with age for so long," announced Ethan, pushing the low gate that had become crooked from old age. The gate opened with a creak, letting a small company of 2 girls and 3 guys into the yard. The young people followed each other onto the property of the cabin, with Ethan leading the way. A bit embarrassed, as if he were ashamed of his rural cottage where he'd brought his friends. He walked first along the narrow beaten path, past a couple of bare autumn raspberry bushes, and stopped near the wooden porch with large cracks in the steps. The guys followed him in single file. Opposite the entrance to the house stood a lonely, narrow bench made from a board and 2 logs. "Let's smoke then, and then throw in our stuff." "Finally made it," said Lluvia, the wife of his friend Jake, not very cheerfully. They traveled on their own so they could drink beer on the road, and the journey had seemed very tedious. An hour and a half by train, then by bus, which they'd had to wait for a long time, then walking with their bags. Will we all even fit in here? I thought it would be something more comfortable after all, she continued. We work with what we have, Ethan said apologetically, sitting on the bench and spreading his hands. In his head, he kept thinking about how one of the guys, Tyler, also had a cabin, only his spread over 20 acres instead of 6 like here, and the house was a solid stone 2-story building. The entire territory was planted with short, bright green grass. No vegetable beds, stumps, apple trees, or berry bushes, and certainly no Colorado beetles. Only from mid-spring to mid-autumn did Tyler's grandparents live in that house, and partying to their heart's content, as the guys had planned, wouldn't have worked with them around. You couldn't relax. But here now, there was no one. The grandmother, who usually stayed here all summer without leaving, had recently been put in the hospital. Nothing serious, but she wouldn't return to the cabin this year. So they could party and let loose as much as they wanted. Of course, the house is old completely, but I hardly ever come here. Usually, Grandma lives here, and if I came to hang out, she'd put me to work in the garden, and I'm not a farmer at all. I think at a cabin you should relax, not work. Tomorrow we can still go mushroom hunting, if we don't get completely wasted. Oh, how beautiful, Emma, Tyler's new girlfriend, exclaimed, interrupting him and pointing at the porch. Everyone turned as if on command. Damn, Grandma dragged them again, Ethan muttered. On the porch, against the log wall, lay several plump, bright orange pumpkins in a neat row. What's with Grandma? The friends chorused. How should I know? Ethan waved his hand. Probably Thelma. All normal people usually plant what in the fall? Right, zucchini. But our entire country street is usually supplied with pumpkins for a year ahead from Grandma Thelma. She has some fixation on pumpkins. But what's wrong with that? I love pumpkin, Jake wondered. I can't stand zucchini anymore. Take them all, gladly, Ethan said joyfully, deftly flicking his cigarette butt over the fence and going to unlock the front door. The guys also finished smoking, picked up their backpacks and bags, with drinks and provisions dropped on the yellowed autumn grass, and followed the host into the house, stomping loudly on the half-rotten porch. Inside it was damp and stuffy and smelled of mold. Both girls looked around disapprovingly. The house has gotten stale, Ethan wrinkled his nose. Now I'll light the stove. Everything will be normal. It takes a while, but it gets very warm. We should fry the pumpkin with dinner. Let it go with the meat, Jake announced knowledgeably, entering the small kitchen on the right. There was a stove, cutting table, and cabinet, and the left half of the room was occupied by a large Russian stove. Wow, this is a real stove. I've never seen one, Tyler said respectfully, patting the stove's white side. Ethan, opening the damper, poked around with a poker at the logs and kindling, and crumpling one of the newspapers that lay in a stack on the table, lit it and stuck it into the stove's mouth. The damp wood caught reluctantly. A tiny flame slowly crawled along the wood. I'd only be happy if you eat all these pumpkins. Taking them home on your own is definitely not necessary. And what else interesting do you have here? The friends crowded in the doorway, somehow not daring to enter the house. Come in, choose sleeping places for yourselves. Just my girlfriend and I get the farthest little room. That's our cozy legal spot. But there are enough sleeping places. We can heat the veranda too, then someone can sleep there. The guests spread throughout the house, with interest examining the traditional interior of the country rooms, the old but sturdy furniture, clay dishes in an ancient glass-fronted cabinet. "Here's where we'll be drinking," Ethan announced joyfully, pointing to a round table under a colorful lampshade. When the guys had chosen beds and unpacked their things and returned to the big room, Tyler said, "Like my ancestors probably partied here too. What's that interesting mirror?" Emma's eyes suddenly opened wide, and she stared at a huge, almost half-wall mirror with an ornate wooden frame. Everyone turned to the wall. "An antique from the estate," Ethan answered importantly. "There's an abandoned manor nearby. Villagers brought it to us once, offered to buy it cheaply. But that was long ago, even before I was born. Look, there's also an antique chair from the estate." He pointed to a massive, squat chair with a peeling carved back and a seat of worn tapestry. The wooden legs were curved, and wide armrests were decorated with an intricate pattern. Olivia immediately sat in the estate chair and proudly straightened her back. Jake pulled out his phone from his jeans pocket and started photographing his wife. "Oh, what's this hanging on it?" Tyler asked with surprise, peering at the antique mirror. "On tape. Damn, it's Grandma again. She listens to Thelma," Ethan said with irritation, approaching the antique object and tearing off the small mesh bags stuffed with pumpkin seeds that were stuck with blue electrical tape. He threw the bags on the table. "Grandma Thelma has already driven everyone crazy with her stupid seeds and this mirror." The friends looked at him curiously. "What's the deal?" "She constantly insists that the mirror should be thrown away, says it brings bad luck and evil is trapped in it. She carries on all this crazy nonsense, says she's seen many deaths, and that the mirror was in the estate when the owners were killed. But I don't know what really happened there. This mirror, of course, doesn't bother me. I'd rather sell it. I think you could make good money from it. But the grandparents are stubborn for some reason. A state mirror in our house, they say." "What kind of counts were there?" Jake asked, immediately starting to rummage through his phone. "What's the family name?" "I didn't even ask," Ethan waved his hand. "I rarely come here at all. Sometimes my parents would come, and Grandma Thelma would drag her pumpkins to them too. If you go to her yard, in autumn it's completely orange. Beautiful, of course." "And why does she hang seeds there?" Emma reminded him. "She says pumpkin seeds block evil. Don't let it out," he snorted. "Just listen to that, seeds block evil. And why did you take them down if they block it? Maybe it's better to hang them back just in case," Emma suggested in a frightened voice. "Don't embarrass me," Ethan snapped. "Look, she scattered these blockers all over the room, hung them up. Look at the walls, peek in the cabinet." The guys started examining the room, and with surprise saw that homemade pictures crookedly laid out with pumpkin seeds hung on the darkened log walls. On the cabinet stood several ugly animal figurines, also thickly covered with seeds. "Grandma Thelma makes these herself," Ethan said sarcastically. "She dries them and starts crafting. Grandpa encourages her. Whatever she secretly brings to our house, he immediately hangs or puts somewhere. And she stuck this bag on the mirror too." "Are they roasted?" Tyler suddenly asked, picking up the bag and examining it curiously under the lampshade. "How should I know?" Ethan laughed. "They've probably been hanging there for several years. I wouldn't even try them." Tyler shrugged, put down the seeds, and the company finally started preparing dinner. Gradually, it became cozier. The stove was heating up, slowly giving warmth to the house. Several hours passed. Time was approaching midnight. The friends had grilled shashlik in the yard and baked pieces of pumpkin on skewers. They'd brought beer with a small reserve, and while there was still enough, everyone's faces were already flushed, and tongues were getting a bit tangled. Only Olivia remained almost sober. She kept hoping she was finally pregnant, and therefore hardly drank. Warmed by the fire and alcohol, the guys got tired of staying in the house at the table under the lampshade. They'd arranged themselves on the bench at the entrance, setting up the grill nearby to fit, and had brought out a couple of stools from the house. For his wife, Jake had asked his friend for the estate chair that she'd liked so much. The September evening was quite warm and windless. The thick smell of freshness and autumn leaves filled the air, and they didn't want to go inside. "Olivia, won't you bring more beer?" Jake asked, stirring the coals in the grill. "I'll get the potatoes ready for now." Olivia went into the house. She'd already reached for the beer pack, but then her gaze froze on the estate mirror. How beautiful it was after all. Olivia approached closer. The glass surface was cloudy and in some places crossed by horizontal black stripes, which made the reflection slightly distorted. This wasn't surprising. The mirror had been made over 100 years ago. Olivia mechanically fixed her hair and, stepping back, began examining the strange object. For some reason, the new owners couldn't simply install it on the floor, so they'd had to attach it to the wall, which made the mirror stand unevenly, protruding forward at the top and hanging over whoever looked into it. Olivia peeked behind it. At the top, a thick iron rod protruded, to which the mirror was tied with old, dusty ropes. To one of the ropes was sewn with threads a familiar transparent bag with pumpkin seeds. Olivia couldn't help but laugh, remembering the story about Grandma Thelma, and then reached up and tore the thread. The bag with seeds fell into her palm. "I'll have to tell the guys what a cunning grandma. She hid one so no one would take it down." She smiled again, threw the seeds on the nearest chair, and continued admiring the antique object. The girl stepped back a small distance. If you stood too close to the mirror, it became uncomfortable from how it seemed to threateningly lean over, oppressing with its massive frame of carved wood. Olivia looked into the eyes of her reflection, and for some reason felt uneasy. What had they said about it? How much had this old mirror seen in its lived century? The ladies who once primped before it had long since passed away. Some died unnatural deaths. Curious Jake had managed to find on the internet that during the Revolution, the family of local counts had been killed. Their name was Ashford, and many things had been looted. Marauders and simply village residents had dragged away a lot. And to this day, many icons and antique jewelry were listed among the stolen items. And then relatives and descendants of those thieves had bought the mirror from Ethan's family. Suddenly, Olivia was gripped by sharp stomach pain, so much so that her breath caught. Clutching herself with both hands, she bent over and pressed her forehead against the mirror. The cold, frozen surface unpleasantly touched her forehead, then warmed up. Olivia's vision blurred, and she barely audibly called, "Jake, I feel sick." No one came. The pain didn't subside, and Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. Yellow circles floated before her eyes. She didn't notice how long she stood like that, but finally the pain began to recede, pulsing. Olivia took a deep breath, but instead of fresh air, she felt dust and staleness penetrate her lungs. Her temples throbbed noticeably, and the place where she'd touched the mirror burned as if an invisible thread was being pulled from it. The girl recoiled from the mirror and saw her pale face in it, and behind her reflection, at the other end of the room, Jake and Ethan entering. They must have gotten tired of waiting for her with the beer. They'd decided to see what was wrong. Olivia turned to them with relief. Behind her back, there was no one. Olivia shuddered and again looked at the mirror, where in complete amazement she saw the guys approaching her, and herself turning away from the mirror surface and taking a step back. The girl again turned sharply to the room, but it was empty. Complete silence reigned. Not a single sound penetrated through the open door. Olivia didn't understand what was happening. Had her mind become clouded after the terrible pain, or maybe she'd lost consciousness? Meanwhile, the reflection, still hunched over, approached the friends, and all three headed toward the exit from the room. Jake gently embraced his wife's shoulders. At the threshold, she suddenly looked back and stared at Olivia. The other woman noticeably nodded and smiled victoriously, and then they all left. The room where Olivia found herself was both familiar and alien at the same time. Looking around as if through fog, the girl understood that the room looked mirror symmetrical to the one where she'd recently been doubled over in stomach pain. I couldn't have gotten into the reflection. What's happening? Turning to the door, she screamed with all her might. Jake, guys, hey, where are you? It seemed that the words in the surrounding silence acquired weight, and like sandbags, fell to the floor with dull thuds, never penetrating beyond the room. On trembling legs, the girl slowly approached the doorway. But as soon as she was about to step over the threshold, the door unexpectedly slammed shut with a muffled thud. Not yet realizing what this meant, Olivia began slowly walking around the room and examining the familiar but reflected objects, feeling cold streams of sweat running down her back and the fine tremor that was overtaking her. No, she wasn't sleeping. She felt everything, even the remnants of the dull pain that had recently made her bend over. It was strange pain, Olivia thought. She'd never experienced anything like it in such situations. Everything in the room's furnishings was unreal, even stage-like. She touched the sofa, table, cabinet door. Her fingers felt cold and ancient dust, but her hands remained clean. Her steps were muffled and soft, as if sounds from them penetrated through plugged ears. Really, it was as if there was cotton, or even invisible dust in her ears. Olivia didn't hear even her own heartbeat, as if she herself had now become unreal or artificial. The girl frantically pulled the door. It opened soundlessly and heavily, as if it were made of a huge concrete slab upholstered with felt that absorbed sounds. Instead of an opening, there was a solid wooden wall covered with a thick layer of dirty dust that hung in some places in clumps, stuck together from dampness and staleness. Help, the girl screamed desperately. Jake, Jake, here. Olivia realized that her voice didn't carry beyond her own throat. It remained in her, a silent scream. Only she felt it, but didn't hear it. This was like screaming in a nightmare, but only now she knew for certain she wasn't sleeping. The girl tried all the ways she knew to make sure she was awake, pulled her hair, pinched herself. Nothing helped, it hurt, but she didn't wake up. She wasn't sleeping. In despair, Olivia rushed to the old cabinet, grabbed a glass, and smashed it on the floor. The glass broke soundlessly, and Olivia, taking a shard and closing her eyes, plunged it into her palm. Her hand cramped from sharp pain, and opening her eyes, the girl saw a trickle of blood flowing down her hand. This couldn't be a dream, even the most terrible one. Olivia wasn't sleeping. She was behind the glass, and her reflection had gone away with the others. She felt burning hot tears on her cheeks, and covering her face with her hands, smearing blood and tears on it, sank powerlessly onto the wooden floor. She almost didn't feel it. It seemed to have the same temperature as her body. And the most terrible thought didn't leave her, that everything happening was impossible, unreal, inadmissible, yet it existed, and there was no way out of it. "What are you stuck there for?" Tyler asked, sprawled in the estate chair, when the trio of Olivia, Jake, and Ethan came down from the porch and joined the rest. "Your husband was waiting for you. Or maybe not you, but the beer," came friendly laughter. The company was in such a cheerful, relaxed state that even a stupid joke seemed funny. Ethan set out the beer on the camping table. Jake silently nodded to Tyler, who, grinning, freed up the chair, moving it closer to Olivia. "How are you, Your Highness?" he said with exaggerated courtesy, and Olivia, making a light, playful curtsy, sat in her place. Jake sat across from his wife, looking at her with loving, tipsy eyes. "Oh," he suddenly muttered, "it seemed to me you had a mole on the other cheek. How's that?" "You're completely drunk, you fool," Tyler slapped him on the shoulder. "You forgot which cheek your wife's mole is on." The friends laughed. Jake shrugged guiltily and lowered his eyes. The girl only smiled silently and barely noticeably, looking at her husband with arrogance. Recently, he'd been quite taciturn, and she was getting tired of it. Apartments of this type, realtors call among themselves coffins. I know because I visited more than one agency looking for housing that would fit my budget in my current situation. But even these coffins that were offered to me with slightly mocking lips were too expensive. The option was to rent a room and live with someone, sharing everyday life, pulling other people's hair from the drain. Right now, I simply didn't have the moral strength for this, especially after a month of living with a friend. Of course, I was very grateful to her for the shelter, but the option was found when I was already sure I'd have to agree to communal living with God knows whom. At the train station that day, I found myself by chance. My friend, with whom I was temporarily living after the divorce, asked me to pick up a ticket she'd reserved for the evening to a neighboring city where she regularly went to see her boyfriend. After buying the ticket, I went out to the square in front of the station and walked onto the little bridge over something resembling a stream flowing near the square. Looking at the stream was unpleasant. Its entire bed was thickly strewn with cigarette butts, so I turned my back to the railing and began examining the people swarming around the morning station. That's when I saw her. A grandmother, absolutely ordinary looking. A beige spring coat from the 70s, an old-fashioned headscarf, and modern UGG boots. What distinguished her was only a cardboard sign hanging on her chest, which I glanced at indifferently, and was about to look away when I suddenly saw words that caught my attention. Studio apartment. That's exactly what they call these tiny apartments, coffins where the kitchen and living room are combined. The bathroom is a tiny closet, and the refrigerator hangs right over your head. Studio apartments are cheap housing. I threw my cigarette toward the stream, adding to its shoreline colony, and slowly moved toward the grandmother. A couple of steps later, I clearly saw the price written on the cardboard, and I quickened my pace. It was almost half the price that agencies were asking, and there was no realtor to pay commission to. The grandmother didn't look like a realtor. I confidently approached and smiled. "Hello, are you renting an apartment?" The grandmother, who had been thoughtfully looking off to the side, perked up and turned to me. The expression of vague anxiety on her face was replaced by a welcoming smile. "Yes, dear, I'm renting. Do you want to rent it? Depends on what kind of apartment it is and where it's located. If it's in a completely remote area, then no." No, almost downtown. It's nearby. Want to go look right now?" The old woman seemed eager. Nothing wrong with going alone. I could have gone with a friend, but she was at work. That's exactly why she asked me to go get the ticket. I don't have any other friends I could quickly call. And honestly, I would have been embarrassed to demonstratively do this in front of the old lady. Let's go, dear." The old woman pulled me by the sleeve, and I automatically followed her. My God, I'm the perfect victim for a maniac. How did I manage to live to 28? I thought as we walked. I remembered a story from the Crime Chronicle about decoy apartments, about people lured into bandits' lairs, about women sold into sex slavery, and about a sweet Pittsburgh grandmother who poisoned and dismembered her tenants. I stopped. No. But I obediently walked behind the old woman, even with some interest, waiting to see what would happen next. Lately, I'd become fatalistic. When we found ourselves in front of a small house in the old center of the city, I experienced strange emotions. On one hand, the house looked creepy. On the other hand, it didn't much resemble a mafia hideout either. Mentally crossing myself, I followed my guide into the dark entrance that smelled of mice and damp rags. "It's not high up, third floor," the grandmother puffed, struggling to climb the stairs. I wasn't used to running up floors, so I patiently waited for her on each landing. At a tall, massive door, the old woman stopped, unlocked it with a big old key, and beckoned me inside. Behind the door stretched a long corridor with doors leading into it. I counted 3 doors on each side and 1 at the end. The old woman walked to the end and unlocked the 7th door on the left. "Come in, don't take off your shoes." I carefully wiped my feet on a torn gray rag and stepped onto the creaking parquet floor. This used to be a communal apartment that was later divided into separate units. Inside, I was met by exactly what I expected to see: a tiny closet, serving as an entrance hall, had no door. And the darkness reigning there made me want to cross it as quickly as possible and enter the room. It really turned out to be tiny, about 10 square meters, no more. The long, tramway-like room stretched to a narrow window that crowned the end of the room and resembled the opening at the end of a telescope. A square protrusion with a door that formed the entrance hall turned out to be the bathroom. Opposite it, along the wall, stretched something resembling a kitchen, a cabinet, sink, hanging cupboard, and a humming old refrigerator. Behind the protrusion was an old red sofa, opposite which was a cabinet with a television. The hostess, who was looking at me with embarrassment, quickly crossed the room and hastily grabbed the remote that lay on the cabinet. "Well, here it is," she said, spreading her arms to encompass the surrounding situation. There was no hope in her voice, only embarrassment, and this stung me. I probably wasn't the first person here who demonstrated the kind of facial expression my features undoubtedly formed. I felt sorry for the old woman, but I'm a freelancer living and working in this coffin. I smiled embarrassedly and backed toward the exit. Very nice, but unfortunately it doesn't suit me. Yes, yes, I already understood, dear. Well, here's my number. Call if you change your mind. The grandmother pulled a homemade business card from her pocket and handed it to me, a neatly cut piece of notebook paper with a phone number written in careful elderly handwriting. My heart squeezed and I took the paper, sure I'd never have to call that number. But fate decided otherwise. That same evening, when my friend came home from work and began hastily packing for the bus, she announced that she was returning with her boyfriend, who would be looking for work in our city, and unfortunately, I'd have to move out. She'd be back in 3 days, and hoped that by then I'd already found something. She left, and I cried all evening lying in the bathtub, with the remainder of wine left over from our recent get-together. I understood that blaming her for something was unfair. She had every right to arrange a love nest with her beloved in her own apartment, and she'd already sheltered me after my husband announced he no longer saw me next to him, and in general, it was time to move on. He moved on, and I had nowhere to go. So, getting out of the bathtub, I found the paper with the grandmother's number in my pocket and called her. The joy in the woman's voice was so genuine that I even felt slightly uncomfortable. After all, it wasn't me doing her a favor, but her renting me housing, albeit pretty grim, for pennies. We agreed that tomorrow I'd come with my things, and I began packing. The next morning, the grandmother was fidgeting near the entrance when I arrived by taxi. She smiled, nodded quickly, and led me to my new home. The apartment looked no better than yesterday, but I decided not to lose heart. My bedspread on the sofa, my curtains, a couple of reproductions, and it would become much cozier. I dragged my suitcase into the room with difficulty, and wasn't surprised when I heard the grandmother click the remote behind me, turning on the television. Some people can't stand silence, but I'd never been one of them. We finally got acquainted. The grandmother, who called herself Dorothy Patterson, sat at the narrow table located near the television cabinet, and with a trembling hand rewrote my data from my passport into a contract. While she was writing, I walked around my new home, touching furniture and walls, turning on the router that, as it turned out, hung in the entrance hall, and finally looked into the bathroom. It turned out to be slightly better than I'd imagined, and even had a narrow washing machine. True, it had no sink. That function was performed by the shower, which was an angular platform with a border tiled over, closed by a curtain. Checking if the faucets worked, and if there was hot water, I returned to the room. The television's murmur was starting to annoy me, and I approached the window, moved aside the thick curtain that half covered the window, and was surprised to step back. Behind the fancy curtain, I saw a shabby wooden window barred from the outside with a grate. I turned around. Why is there a grate here? This is the 3rd floor. Dorothy nervously smiled. I don't know. This apartment belonged to my late sister. I haven't changed anything here. I felt a light shiver run down my spine. I became anxious. What did she die of? Without looking at me, the hostess muttered, "She didn't die here, don't worry. Live peacefully." But her tone made me feel anything but peaceful, and I nervously swallowed. But my anxiety reached its peak when Dorothy, already standing at the door, turned around. "Just don't turn off the television. Let it work. The bills are small, don't worry about that." I wasn't worried about the bills at all. What? Why? The old woman directly shook her head. "Don't turn it off, that's all. even at night. Just turn down the volume." "Are you serious? And what will happen if I turn it off?" The hostess looked at me grimly and without a smile. "Nothing will happen, but it's better not to turn it off. This place isn't the most pleasant, otherwise I wouldn't rent it so cheaply. And if the power goes out, then it's better to leave somewhere until it comes back on." While I was thinking about what I should answer to this absurdity, the front door closed with the sound of a snapping mousetrap. I was left alone. Calm down, calm down. Feeling panic rising, I turned around and approached the kitchen cabinet where I'd seen old cups during the inspection. I took one out and went to the sofa where my jacket was lying. Taking cigarettes from the pocket, I clicked the lighter, took a drag, looked around my new home, and started crying. This wasn't rock bottom yet, but I was already close. Pulling myself together and chiding myself, I stood up, opened the window with difficulty, letting fresh air into the room. Enough whining. I need to learn to live differently and find the positives. Here's just one thing: the television was very annoying. Turning it off, I realized I could no longer ignore the hunger that had settled in my stomach, and putting on my jacket, I headed out to look for a grocery store. I found a supermarket according to Google Maps 3 blocks from my new home. Walking between the aisles with a cart, I even began to enjoy my solitude and freedom. I had money for now, but soon I'd need to take on a new project. When I returned with full bags to the apartment, I was met by a ringing, tense silence, strange as that sounds. Unpacking the bags and turning on the disgustingly humming old refrigerator, I felt this tension more and more strongly. The space seemed to create a vacuum behind my back. The feeling was so unpleasant that I rolled my shoulders as if trying to shake off a blanket and turned around sharply. The room looked as gloomy and godforsaken as before, but there was nothing scary in it. Hastily scrambling eggs on the old induction stove, I took out my laptop from my bag and stretched out on the sofa for work. No one had canceled work, and it needed to be done. But 15 minutes later, I realized I couldn't work. The refrigerator's humming pressed on my eardrums, and the walls, covered with faded yellow wallpaper, seemed to hang over me. Fear began creeping into my chest. Shivering, I reached for the remote and clicked the button. The room filled with the melody of some TV show intro, and the tension released me. Maybe the hostess had meant exactly this when she advised turning on the television. I'd always worked in silence before, but now I had to do it to the muffled voices from the talking box. The television was annoying, but without it, it was even worse. Gradually, I became so absorbed in work that I completely forgot about it. When I finally put away the laptop, it had already gotten quite dark in the room. Getting up, I stretched, clicked the light switch, and the room was flooded with unpleasant dim yellow light from an old glass shade with one bulb. From the long work and background chatter, my head had become foggy, and I turned off the television, blissfully listening to the ensuing silence. Taking a cigarette from the pack, I threw open the window and leaned on the windowsill, looking at the quiet green yard flooded with orange light from a street lamp at the corner. The cigarette had burned down to half when I suddenly felt that tension in the air again. Something heavy and cotton-like seemed to fall on me, and I turned my head around. Turning back, I saw only an empty room, but as soon as I turned back to the window, the feeling returned. It seemed to me that someone was standing behind my back. I could feel a foreign gaze drilling into me, and a hand that was about to touch the hair on the back of my neck. My knees were trembling. The cigarette had long since burned out, but I continued staring out the window, afraid to turn around. Only when I was completely frozen did I slowly, on cotton legs, turn around and, of course, saw nothing. In one leap, I covered the distance to the cabinet, grabbed the remote, and turned on the television. The voices sounding from the speaker dispelled the illusion of a foreign presence, and I exhaled. I couldn't fall asleep that first night. I was used to sleeping in darkness and silence, and the television was terribly bothersome. But there was no question of turning it off. When I tried to do this, the darkness in the room thickened and pressed down on me like a slab. The walls squeezed together, and the air rang. So I had to turn it back on immediately. I lay awake until morning, and only when the sun rose and the illumination from the television stopped being so contrasting did I finally doze off. The alarm I'd set for 10 in the morning pulled me from sleep after 4 hours, and I sat on the bed with a cast iron head. After smoking, taking a shower, I realized I couldn't spend another minute here. So after hastily having breakfast, I got dressed, packed my laptop, and went to look for nearby cheap cafes with Wi-Fi where I could work. This began my wandering through all the coffee shops and eateries in the area. I had catastrophically little money, and the maximum I could afford was to nurse 2 cups of coffee a day, sometimes furtively eating a store-bought pastry while hiding behind my laptop. The waiters looked at me with contempt, but there was no question of returning to my studio. Being there became more difficult each day. The faded yellow walls with wavy patterns and running cracks, the yellowish ceiling, the creaking wooden floor that remained dirty no matter how much you swept it, and the silent, dusty fold-out sofa with a crack down the center into which I constantly slipped at night. The humming old refrigerator, the crackling electric stove, the window reeking of peeling paint every time you touched the frame. All of this was so hateful to me that I wanted to cry. But worst of all was the atmosphere in the apartment, that feeling of presence that tormented me from the moment I moved in, and also the constant stuffiness and lack of air, which, despite the open window, almost didn't circulate in this elongated coffin. Sleeping there, thank God, I learned to do. I had to buy earplugs and a sleep mask. With them, I slept more or less normally and had almost stopped being afraid at night. Until one night, I woke up needing the bathroom. Taking off the eye mask, I looked at the television, and half asleep, almost died of horror when I saw a terribly disfigured face on the screen. I would have screamed if I could, but only something like a prolonged hoarse croak came from my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut. My heart was pounding wildly from the adrenaline rush. My hands began shaking, and it took me several seconds to open my eyes again and look at the screen. It turned out to be just a crime show about past crimes. But before my heart calmed down and my hands stopped shaking, quite a bit of time passed. When I was little, I had the same nightmare 2 or 3 times. I was a timid child, afraid of horror movies and even books with scary covers, and the dream I had several times was like this. I dreamed that I was in a room either adjacent to the living room or in the living room itself, where a television was on, and I stood with my back to it. I knew that it was showing something unbearably, nauseatingly scary. So scary that the mere thought of looking at the screen filled me with horror. In the dream, my parents calmly watched this horror and didn't react to my pleas to turn it off. and I couldn't leave the room without turning to face the television and seeing what it was broadcasting. "Marble balls," a voice on the television in the dream said. "Marble balls." What did this mean? The phrase filled me with such strong dread that seeing it seemed tantamount to death. I would wake up in a cold sweat, and for several days after this dream, I'd walk past the television with internal tension. What happened strangely echoed my childhood nightmare. I was trembling with fear when I washed my hands after the toilet. I'd already decided long ago that I'd move out of here as soon as I found at least something. There still weren't any normal options, not even decent rooms, and I had nowhere to go. In the morning, I called the hostess. I don't know why, I just wanted to talk to her about the apartment, but she didn't answer. For some reason, I wasn't surprised by this. A few days later, I experienced what I'd asked about on that very first day. What would happen if the power went out? In the evening, I returned from another cafe, hungry and chilled, put water on to boil pasta, and the television I turned on practically from the doorway. I developed the habit of not parting with the remote. I already knew all the evening TV programs, series, and shows on all the channels that the antenna caught, the wire from which went through a hole in the wall to the outside. The pasta was just starting to boil when the bulb, already dim, flashed even brighter above me and went out. The television and refrigerator, of course, also died, and I froze like a statue for a moment, listening to the quieting bubbling in the pot. When the water became still, such silence pressed down on me that I automatically touched my ears to check if there were earplugs in them. Fear immediately crawled into my heart with a narrow snake, instantly growing wider and expanding like a tumor. On cotton legs, I approached the dimly glowing window and looked outside. The neighboring houses, the yard, everything was flooded in ink-black darkness, a blackout for our entire small area. With the back of my head, I felt that familiar gaze. Weightless fingers seemed to touch my neck. I felt short of breath, but turning back was much scarier. I was convulsively trying to breathe and gathering strength to turn around, grab the jacket I'd thrown on the sofa when I came in, and be at the door in 3 jumps, when suddenly behind me, there was a hiss and a loud click that knocked the remaining breath out of my chest. With a short scream, I turned around and saw that the television had turned on. The sight was so absurd that for some time I stood with my mouth open. There was no power in the entire area, but the television was somehow working. I wouldn't have been the least bit surprised at that second if the dead girl from The Ring had appeared on the screen, but the screen showed something else. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Looking closer, I saw a long corridor with doors on both sides and one at the end. My hair stood up on my head when I realized this resembled the corridor I walked through daily before entering my apartment. The doors on the screen were closed, but suddenly the one at the end opened slightly, and I recoiled from the screen. The feeling that had haunted me in my childhood nightmare covered me with horror from head to toe. The picture on the screen exuded otherworldly dread, which wasn't surprising considering the television was working despite all the laws of physics. With a trembling hand, I reached for the cord and pulled it with all my strength, but the picture on the screen didn't even flicker. My legs gave out, and I crawled away from the screen, backing up against the sofa. My mouth went dry, my heart pounded in my chest. Unable to tear my gaze from the television, I watched as a silhouette appeared in the open door on the screen, moving with strange, small steps toward the camera. At first, I didn't understand what was wrong with it, but then it dawned on me that the silhouette was moving backward. She mustn't turn around, mustn't look. Horror launched me like a spring. I jumped to my feet, grabbed my jacket, and rushed to the door. In the entrance hall closet, complete darkness reigned, and I felt around for where the door handle should be. There was no handle, and there was no door. With trembling hands, I took out my lighter from my pocket, lit it on the third try, and gasped. There was no door. In its place was the same wall covered with yellow wallpaper. I backed away and began moving the lighter along the walls until it burned my fingers and I dropped it. There was no door, not a trace of one. Moreover, the bathroom door had also disappeared. I threw a helpless glance at the television and hurriedly looked away, seeing that the creature on the screen was getting closer and closer, gradually filling all the space. If she turns around, if she turns around. Panic spurred me on, and without thinking about anything, I rushed to the window, jerked the window frame, inhaled the icy air, jumped onto the windowsill, and the damn grate. Here's why it was here. I helplessly grabbed the bars, realizing I couldn't squeeze through them. But what lived in the television, what stupid TV shows and soap operas drove away, was getting closer. I felt it behind my back. Not breath because it doesn't breathe. Not touch because it can't touch. I felt only horror that made me curl up in a ball and press my face against the grate bars. Maybe if I lean on it, it'll fall out. I didn't want to think about what would happen to me. The darkness behind my back thickened. I saw reflections from the screen and knew that if I turned around. Marble balls, marble balls. Hey, what's wrong with you? Need help? A voice burst into my brain so suddenly that for a second I didn't even understand what I'd heard. Opening my tightly shut eyes, I looked down. Under my window stood a man dressed in a jacket with a hood, whom I seemed to have seen several times in the yard from my window. In his hand glowed a cigarette. I sobbed convulsively and felt in my jacket pocket for keys, unclenched my fingers, and they fell onto the asphalt under the window. Please, apartment 33. There's something wrong with my door. My words were interrupted by sobs, but when the man picked up the keys and raised his head, I seemed to burst open. Get me out of here. Get me out, please. Just don't look at the television. I screamed and, closing my eyes, burst into tears. The glow from the screen behind my back became so bright that I literally felt it with the back of my head. Faster, faster. I don't know how much time passed before I heard a blow behind me, and a minute later, strong hands pulled me from the windowsill. Muttering something, my neighbor scooped me up and dragged me out of the apartment like firefighters carry people from a fire. I kept my eyes closed when we were in the entrance hall, but still opened them slightly like Lot's wife, and out of the corner of my eye saw the room. Fortunately, the refrigerator blocked the television from this angle, and before I could see the screen, I closed my eyes again. I opened them for the second time, only when the smell of the entrance was left behind, and I felt the freshness of the autumn night. How are you? Everything okay? My neighbor led me to a bench and sat me on it. I was still holding my jacket, clutching it with deadened fingers, but looking at his silhouette in the darkness of the yard lit only by a distant street lamp. I came to my senses a bit and unclenched my hands. Carefully putting on my jacket, I took cigarettes from the pocket. Without saying a word, my neighbor flicked his lighter. For some time we smoked in silence. I didn't know this person, but he had just saved me from what exactly had happened there. It was madness, hallucinations. How could I explain this to him? I fidgeted, and my neighbor extended his hand to me. "By the way, I'm Marcus, and you're Jessica." I shook his palm, and we fell silent again. Finally, I gathered my strength. "Marcus, thank you. I don't know what to say. Something strange happened there. I don't know how to explain. I'm not a drug addict, don't think that." "I don't think so. All the neighbors know about that apartment." Marcus flicked his cigarette butt into the bushes and turned to me. "What do they know?" "A woman lived there for several years, middle-aged, lonely. The sister of the one who now brings tenants like you. Once she fell out the window and broke her neck. She didn't die here, don't worry." Remembering the hostess's words, I smiled grimly. "Yeah, she didn't die in this apartment, that's true. She didn't lie about that. And then her son moved in, who it turned out she had, and 3 months later, the same thing. He also fell out the window. He survived, but seems to have broken his spine, became disabled. Now, I think, his aunt takes care of him. I don't know the details. You'd have to ask our local grandmothers." Dorothy Patterson put in the grate. "Yeah, that's the current hostess. Yeah, she started renting out this hole, but all the tenants don't last more than a month. I don't know what's wrong with that apartment, but something's clearly going on. Everyone runs away looking like they're not themselves. And here you are too." The cold was getting under my jacket, and I shivered. "There's something wrong with the television. Did you see that I turned around to look at my apartment window, but didn't find it? The television was no longer working. The darkness covering the yard had become even denser. I turned to the silent Marcus and saw that he was sitting with his back to me. My throat immediately went dry. I didn't want him to turn around. "Everything came together," Marcus said without turning. "I was just thinking, there are so many strange stories about that place. Maybe it's better if we both just walked away from here and never came back." His voice was different now, colder, and he still hadn't turned around. It's deep night, and I lie unable to sleep. Rare cars pass by, and then the light from headlights penetrates the bedroom. The silence is broken only by the light breathing of my little boy. He ran around all day, got tired, pressed against me with his whole body, hugged me with his thin little arms, and breathes into my shoulder. But I can't sleep, and I get up very quietly from the bed so as not to disturb the baby. But I haven't even taken 2 steps when behind me comes his sleepy whisper. "Mom, where are you going?" "Sleep, sleep, sweetheart. I'll drink some water and come back soon." "Okay," he sighs quietly, and immediately I hear his deep, measured breathing again. In the darkness, I go to the kitchen, find a glass, pour water from the pitcher. I don't turn on the light, there's enough from the streetlights outside. I drink in small sips, slowly and alertly. My hands are trembling. My injured finger aches, probably it's going to rain. I move the curtain aside and look out at the street. Cold, damp autumn. The last leaves are falling. Bare branches sway in the gusty wind that flies in from the Pacific Ocean. Damp, empty, lonely. I so want to talk to someone, but I didn't bring my phone with me. And besides, it's late now. Everyone's been asleep for a long time. How much time do I have? A month, a day, an hour? If only I could last until New Year's. But it's still only October, so long. Though there are chances, I'll try to do everything right. I think I've managed to find the right tactics. Of course, hiding from him gets harder every day, but still there are chances. I just need to. I hear behind me my baby, my sweet little one, stands in the doorway and rubs his sleepy eyes with little fists. Mom, let's go to sleep. Don't think about bad things. What a good boy. Why did you get up? You know I won't leave you. I take him in my arms, so sweet, so warm, but already heavy. He's grown in recent months. How fast he's growing. We go to the bedroom, lie down, and almost immediately he falls asleep. But I lie next to him, unable to sleep. The branches outside the window sway in the wind, creating strange shadows. I remember how it all began and how happy I was, how many hopes and dreams there were. And now I only want to sleep forever, once and for all. Almost 4 years ago, I came to my father's house in a small coastal town near Monterey, California. It was a long-awaited vacation for me. A recent terrible story with multiple deaths had worn me out completely. A cargo ship had gone down in a storm, taking 12 sailors with it. Our entire insurance office had been turned upside down, and my company too, of course. But still, we'd sorted everything out, cases reviewed, payments to relatives assigned. Let the Coast Guard deal with the rest, and I'd just take at least a little rest and catch the end of summer. Dad met me joyfully, warmly. Of course, after Mom's death from cancer 2 years earlier, he really missed simple human communication. But still, he was holding up well. He'd even built a new deck and fixed up the old fishing boat. I so wanted to spend this month alone with him, to talk, to work on the property together, to fish and swim to our heart's content. But alas, he just signed on with a new shipping company, so literally in a week he had to return to sea. But still, a whole week with Dad, and then 3 more weeks alone in a coastal house by the Pacific, so warm and calm at this time of year. I hoped to rest properly and gain strength. The first week flew by unnoticed. Dad was affectionate and seemed truly happy for the first time since Mom's funeral. But still, something wouldn't leave him alone. In the evenings, he often went out on the deck, looked into the distance where waves crashed against the rocks below, and tensely thought about something. He smoked more than usual. He wouldn't answer questions or just made jokes, clearly not wanting to worry me. But I felt something was wrong. And those guns, Dad had never been much of a hunter. But now he'd gotten out his old 12-gauge shotgun, cleaned it thoroughly, and mounted it above the fireplace mantel. He said the coyotes had been getting closer to the house lately. I remember we sat on the deck on the last evening before his departure. Dad smoked his pipe and stared out at the darkening ocean. Finally, he knocked out the ashes and said, "Rebecca, I'm shipping out tomorrow. Are you absolutely sure you want to stay here? In San Francisco, you have friends, entertainment, that nice apartment." I assured him that I didn't want to go back to the city. Truthfully, the noisy urban life had quite exhausted me in recent months. The insurance business was getting more cutthroat every year. Dad was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and began pacing the deck. "I see you're worried, but I don't understand why. It's not like you're going to sea for the first time, and it's not like I'm staying alone for the first time. Promise me," he stopped pacing and looked at me intently. "Promise me you won't go down to the beach alone, especially not at night." I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "I know you're a strong swimmer, honey, but the currents here can be tricky. And there've been incidents, people going missing. The sheriff thinks it might be a vagrant camp up in the hills, but he trailed off, shaking his head. But what, Dad? Just promise me. You can call the Peterson boys if you want company for swimming. Hell, invite some friends up from the city. But don't go to the water alone. Please, it's important to me. I wanted to laugh at his fears. I'd been swimming in these waters since I was a child. But Dad looked so serious, so genuinely worried, that I gave in. I promised not to go to the ocean alone. Our little town of Cypress Point wasn't big, maybe 300 year-round residents. Most everyone knew everyone else, at least by sight. But there was one newcomer I'd noticed, someone I definitely didn't recognize from my childhood summers here. He was gorgeous, the kind of man who looked like he'd stepped off the cover of a romance novel. Tall, perfectly built, with shoulder-length dark hair and the kind of tan that spoke of long days in the sun. The kind of man who made women stop and stare. I caught myself doing exactly that several times during my first week there. But we were strangers, and despite my city confidence, I'd never been the type to make the first move with men like that. In my experience, guys who looked like Greek gods usually went for women who looked like Greek goddesses. And then one morning, I broke my promise to Dad. I'd been restless all night, thinking about work, about Mom, about the lonely years stretching ahead. Dawn was just breaking when I slipped out of the house in my swimsuit and headed down the cliff path to our private beach. The water was perfect cool, but not cold, with gentle waves that barely broke against the sand. I swam out past the kelp beds, floating on my back and watching the sky lighten from purple to pink to gold. I was so lost in the beauty of the morning that I didn't notice him at first. When I finally swam back toward shore, he was sitting on a piece of driftwood, watching me with an amused smile. "Beautiful morning for a swim," he said as I waded out of the surf. My heart hammered as I walked up the beach toward where I'd left my towel. He was even more gorgeous up close, perfect features, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could have melted glaciers. "I'm sorry if I'm trespassing," I said, wrapping the towel around myself. "This is private property, but most locals know they can use the beach." "I'm not local," he said, standing up. "Just passing through." But I couldn't resist the water. It called to me. There was something odd about the way he said that, but I was too flustered by his presence to think about it much. "I'm Rebecca," I said. "You can call me Gabriel," he replied, and when he smiled, I felt my knees go weak. I don't remember much about our conversation that morning. I was too busy trying to seem sophisticated and worldly while wearing nothing but a damp swimsuit and a beach towel. But by the time the sun was fully up, I'd invited him back to the house for coffee. Dad would have killed me if he'd known. Don't trust strangers, especially handsome ones. But Gabriel seemed so charming, so genuinely interested in me, that all my usual caution evaporated. Over coffee on the deck, he told me he was a marine biologist, traveling up and down the coast doing research. He spoke knowledgeably about ocean currents and marine ecosystems, and seemed fascinated when I told him about my work in insurance. "You must see the aftermath of so many tragedies," he said, his blue eyes full of sympathy. "How do you handle all that pain and loss?" No one had ever asked me that before. Not my ex-boyfriend, not my friends, certainly not my colleagues. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't expected. By the time he left that afternoon, I was completely smitten. He came back the next day, and the next. We walked on the beach, explored tide pools, talked for hours about everything and nothing. He was the most attentive listener I'd ever met, hanging on my every word as if I were the most fascinating person in the world. And then, on his fourth visit, he kissed me. I'd been kissed before, of course, but nothing had prepared me for this. It was like electricity, like fire, like drowning and being saved all at once. When he pulled away, I was breathless and dizzy. "I have to tell you something," he said softly, his hands still cupping my face. "I'm not entirely what I seem." "What do you mean?" I whispered. But instead of answering, he kissed me again, and all my questions disappeared. The next 3 weeks were like living in a dream. Gabriel came to see me every day, and we made love with a passion I'd never experienced before. He was insatiable, and so was I. We barely left the house, except to swim together in the ocean, where he moved through the water with an almost supernatural grace. Sometimes I caught him staring out at the waves, with an expression I couldn't read, longing, maybe, or hunger. When I asked him about it, he'd just smile and change the subject. I was completely, helplessly in love. When my vacation time was almost up, I begged him to come back to San Francisco with me. We could get an apartment together, start a real relationship, maybe even get married someday. "I can't leave the ocean," he said sadly. "It's part of who I am." "Then I'll stay here," I said immediately. "I can work remotely or find something local." But he shook his head. "You have a life in the city, a career. I won't let you give that up for me." On my last day, we made love one final time on the beach as the sun set over the Pacific. Afterward, as we lay tangled together on the sand, I told him I thought I might be pregnant. His reaction was not what I expected. Instead of shock or concern, his eyes lit up with something that looked almost like triumph. He rolled on top of me, pinning me to the sand, and for a moment I saw something predatory in his beautiful face. "Are you sure?" he asked urgently. I don't know for certain. I'll take a test when I get home." He kissed me then, hard and possessive, his fingers digging into my shoulders almost painfully. "If you are," he whispered against my lips, "you'll keep it. Promise me." "Gabriel, we should talk about this." "Promise me?" His voice was sharp, commanding in a way I'd never heard before. Yes, okay, I promise." He smiled then, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile I'd grown accustomed to. This smile was cold, satisfied, like a predator that had just successfully hunted its prey. I should have recognized the warning signs, should have listened to the voice in my head that was screaming danger. But I was in love, and love makes fools of us all. 3 weeks later, back in my San Francisco apartment, the pregnancy test confirmed what I already knew. I was carrying Gabriel's child. I tried calling the number he'd given me, but it was disconnected. I drove back to Cypress Point, hoping to find him, but he was gone without a trace. None of the locals remembered seeing him, which was impossible in a town that small. It was as if he'd never existed at all. For a while, I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. I was financially stable, independent. I could raise a child on my own. Maybe it was even for the best. Gabriel had been wonderful, but there'd been something otherworldly about him, something not quite human. I was 2 months along when he came back. I was working late in my apartment when I heard a key turn in the lock. My blood ran cold. I'd had the locks changed after a break-in the year before, and only I had the key. Gabriel walked in as if he owned the place, as beautiful and perfect as ever. But now I could see what I'd missed before, the predatory grace, the inhuman stillness, the way his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Hello, Rebecca," he said calmly. "How's our baby? How did you get in? How did you even find me?" He smiled that cold smile I'd seen on the beach. "I can find you anywhere. The child calls to me. What do you want?" "I want you to have my baby, of course. Raise it well. Give it everything it needs to grow strong. And then what? You'll just disappear again." "Oh no," he said softly. "I'll be watching, always watching, making sure nothing happens to what's mine." I backed away from him, my hand instinctively going to my still flat stomach. Get out now, or I'll call the police." His laugh was like the sound of waves crashing against rocks. "Go ahead, call them. Tell them what? That the father of your child came to visit. You're not the father, you're not even human." His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than I remembered. "Very good. Most humans never figure it out. What are you?" "Does it matter? You're carrying my child now. That makes you mine, whether you like it or not." I lunged for the phone, but he was faster than any human had a right to be. His hand closed around my wrist with crushing force, and I cried out in pain. "Don't make this difficult, Rebecca. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you force me to. Let go of me. Will you be a good mother? Will you protect our child?" When I didn't answer immediately, his grip tightened until I felt bones grinding together. "Yes, yes, I'll protect the baby." He released me so suddenly that I stumbled backward. "Good. I knew you'd see reason. What do you want from me?" "Just what I said. Have the baby. Raise it. Keep it safe." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Rebecca, don't try to run. Don't try to hide. I'll always find you. The child is part of me, and I can sense it wherever you go." After he left, I called my father. Through tears and panic, I tried to explain what had happened. Dad listened without interruption, then told me to pack a bag and drive to Cypress Point immediately. "Don't go to the house," he said. "Meet me at the old lighthouse. And Rebecca, bring the shotgun from my closet." I did as he said, driving through the night with the loaded shotgun on the passenger seat beside me. Dad was waiting at the lighthouse, his face grim in the moonlight. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. I told him about Gabriel, about the pregnancy, about the impossible way he'd gotten into my apartment. When I finished, Dad was quiet for a long time. "I was afraid of this," he said finally. "Afraid of what?" "There are things in the ocean, Rebecca. Old things. Things that were here long before humans ever set foot on this continent. Most of them keep to the deep water, but sometimes—" He shrugged helplessly. "You're saying he's some kind of sea monster." "I'm saying your Gabriel isn't human, and neither is the thing you're carrying." I put my hand on my stomach protectively. "Don't call my baby a thing. Rebecca, listen to me. These creatures, they're parasites. They use human women to breed, to create hybrids that can live both on land and in the sea. The children always favor their inhuman parent. You don't know that. It could be perfectly normal." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Already, only 2 months pregnant, I felt strange changes in my body. I was constantly thirsty, craving salt water. When I bathed, I found myself staying underwater longer than should have been possible. And there were the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of swimming in dark, endless depths, breathing water as easily as air. "There might be a way," Dad said quietly, "to end this before it goes too far." No, the word came out harder than I'd intended. I won't kill my baby, Rebecca. No, I don't care what he is or what it is. This is my child. Dad sighed and pulled me into a hug. Then we'll figure out another way. But you need to know what you're dealing with. The pregnancy was unlike anything described in the medical books. I was sick constantly for the first few months, but it wasn't normal morning sickness. I vomited seawater, no matter what I ate or drank. My skin became dry and scaly, requiring constant moisturizing with salt water. And I was always hungry. Not for normal food, but for raw fish, seaweed, things I'd never been able to stomach before. Dr. Martinez, my obstetrician, was baffled by my symptoms, but assured me the baby was developing normally. Too normally, in fact. It was growing faster than it should, and the ultrasounds showed a child far more developed than the dates would suggest. Gabriel didn't visit again during the pregnancy, but I felt his presence. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of a figure watching from the ocean when I walked on the beach. Once, I woke to find wet footprints on my bedroom floor, though the windows and doors were all locked. When I went into labor 3 weeks early, it was during a storm. The contractions started just as the first lightning split the sky, and I barely made it to the hospital before the baby came. He was perfect, absolutely, heartbreakingly perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the most beautiful blue eyes I'd ever seen. Dr. Martinez declared him completely healthy, if a bit large for a supposedly premature baby. But I knew the truth. Even as I held him for the first time, I could see Gabriel in his features. And when he opened his mouth to cry, I saw the sharp, pointed teeth that no newborn should have. I named him Michael, after my grandfather. For the first few months, he seemed like any other baby. He ate, slept, and grew at a normal rate. I allowed myself to hope that maybe Dad had been wrong. Maybe the inhuman traits would never manifest. I should have known better. Michael's first word wasn't mama or dada. It was water, spoken clearly and distinctly at 7 months old. By his first birthday, he could hold his breath underwater for over 10 minutes. His baby teeth fell out early, replaced by rows of sharp, serrated teeth that looked more shark-like than human. And he was strong, impossibly strong. By 18 months, he could bend metal bars, tear through baby-proofed cabinets like they were made of paper. I had to replace his crib 3 times before giving up and letting him sleep in my bed. The pediatrician was concerned about his development, recommending specialist after specialist. But what could I tell them? That my son was half sea monster. The incidents with other children started when Michael was 2. We were at a playground when a little girl tried to take his toy. He bit her so badly that she needed 12 stitches. The parents threatened to sue, and I had to pay for her medical bills out of pocket. After that, I stopped taking him to public places. We moved out of the city to a small house on the coast, where there were fewer people to notice that my son wasn't quite human. Dad helped as much as he could, but I could see the fear in his eyes whenever he looked at Michael. The boy seemed to sense it too, and took obvious pleasure in making my father uncomfortable. He would stare at Dad with those unnaturally blue eyes, smiling with his sharp teeth, until Dad had to leave the room. When Michael was 3, Gabriel returned. I was giving the boy a bath when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My blood went cold. I'd learned to recognize the sound of wet feet on hardwood floors. "Hello, Rebecca." I spun around to find Gabriel standing in the bathroom doorway, as beautiful and terrible as ever. Water dripped from his hair and clothes, forming puddles on the floor. "Daddy," Michael squealed with delight, reaching his arms toward Gabriel. "Hello, my son," Gabriel said softly, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Look how big you've grown." Michael tried to climb out of the tub toward his father, but I held him back. "Don't touch him." Gabriel's eyes never left mine as he knelt beside the bathtub. "He's perfect, isn't he? Everything I hoped he would be. What do you want?" "Just to see how my boy is developing, and to give you some guidance about his future." "We don't need your guidance." Gabriel's hand shot out faster than I could react, gripping my wrist with crushing force. "You do, actually. Michael is entering a critical phase of his development. Without proper guidance, he could become problematic. Let go of me. Promise me you'll listen." "Fine, I'll listen." He released me and turned his attention to Michael, who was watching the exchange with bright, interested eyes. "Your son needs to hunt," Gabriel said matter-of-factly. "It's in his nature. The longer you deny him this, the more dangerous he'll become." "Hunt what fish to start?" "Small marine life. Eventually," he shrugged. "Whatever he can catch. He's 3 years old." "He's not human, Rebecca. Human rules don't apply to him." I pulled Michael out of the bathtub and wrapped him in a towel, holding him protectively against my chest. "Get out." "This isn't a request," Gabriel said coldly. "It's a warning. Deny him his nature, and he'll take what he needs anyway, probably from someone you care about." As if to prove his father's point, Michael suddenly bit down hard on my shoulder. His sharp teeth pierced my shirt and skin, and I cried out in pain and surprise. "Michael, no." But he didn't let go. If anything, he bit harder, and I felt blood begin to flow. It was Gabriel who finally pried the boy's jaws apart. "He's hungry," Gabriel said calmly, as if children regularly tried to eat their mothers. "Feed him properly, and this won't happen again." After they both left Michael, vanishing into the ocean with his father as easily as walking, I sat on my bathroom floor and cried. The bite marks on my shoulder were deep and ragged, and would leave permanent scars. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. But what choice did I have? The answer came 6 months later, when Michael killed Mrs. Henderson's cat. Our elderly neighbor had been kind to us, bringing over casseroles and offering to babysit when I needed to run errands. She was one of the few people who didn't seem afraid of Michael, though she should have been. I found her sobbing in her backyard, holding the remains of Whiskers, her 15-year-old tabby. The poor animal had been torn apart with inhuman savagery, its flesh stripped from its bones. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, knowing it was inadequate. "It was that boy of yours, wasn't it?" she said through her tears. "I saw him in my yard this morning. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. Yes, I'm sorry, I'll pay for." "I don't want your money," she said firmly. "I want you to get help for that child before he kills something bigger than a cat." That night I called Dad. "I can't do this anymore," I told him. "He's getting stronger, more violent. What happens when he starts school? What happens when he's big enough to really hurt someone?" "We'll figure something out," Dad said, but I could hear the defeat in his voice. "No, we won't. You know what needs to happen." There was a long silence. Finally, Dad said, "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. It would have to look like an accident, a gas leak maybe, or a fire." "I know, Rebecca. He's still your son." "No," I said quietly, watching Michael play in the bathtub, his gills fluttering as he breathed underwater. He's Gabriel's son. He always was. He made our plans carefully. Dad would rig an explosion in the house's basement, making it look like a gas leak. We'd both be inside when it happened, a tragic accident that claimed the lives of a single mother and her young son. The date was set for New Year's Eve. There would be fireworks anyway, so one more explosion wouldn't seem out of place. But as the days passed, I found myself wavering. Michael was a monster, yes, but he was also my baby. The child I'd carried for 9 months, nursed at my breast, sung to sleep with lullabies. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I could see traces of my own humanity in him. The way he laughed at silly faces, the way he cuddled against me when he was sleepy. He was a killer, but he was also just a little boy who didn't understand that what he was doing was wrong. Tonight, as I watch him sleep, I'm still not certain I can go through with it. He looks so innocent in the moonlight, so small and vulnerable. But then I remember Mrs. Henderson's tears, the fear in other parents' eyes when they see us coming, the way my father can't bear to be in the same room as his own grandson. Michael stirs in his sleep, and for a moment his features shift, becoming more angular, more predatory. His gills flutter open along his neck, and his teeth gleam white and sharp in the darkness. This is what he really is, what he'll always be. In 2 hours, Dad will trigger the explosion. Michael and I will die together, and the world will be safe from what we've created. I lean down and kiss his forehead gently. "Sleep, my darling," I whisper. "Sleep, my little monster. It will all be over soon." The humid New Orleans night pressed against the tall windows of the Crescent Theater like a living thing, thick with the scent of magnolia, and the distant jazz drifting from the French Quarter. Marcus Johnson tightened the last knot on the safety cable, a steel line that could hold an elephant, probably. He checked the carabiner. The metallic click echoed hollowly in the silence beneath the grand arches of the old opera house. Wearily, he straightened up, working the kinks out of his aching back, and surveyed the dark, resonant, almost tangible emptiness of the auditorium from the height of the narrow work catwalks under the very ceiling of the historic Crescent Theater. Down below, the velvet seats seemed like rows of silent spectators from the past, drowning in shadows, their worn upholstery gleaming faintly in the reflected light from 2 dim work lamps on the front stage. The enormous crystal chandelier under the dome, the theater's pride, was extinguished and shrouded in gray fabric, resembling a giant dead spider caught in its own web of dust and shadows. The silence was unusual, thick, oppressive silence for this place, that during the day lived and breathed with the noise of rehearsals, booming directors' commands, the screech of moving scenery, the creak of the revolving stage, the hum of hundreds of voices, actors, workers, audience members. At night, the theater fell into a heavy, restless sleep, leaving its countless secrets, its legends, and its ghosts of the past to those few who were forced to stay awake within its ancient walls. Marcus, a stage technician with almost 15 years of experience, with strong, calloused hands and a tired, unshaven face, had long grown accustomed to these night vigils. He knew this theater like the back of his hand, every secret passage behind the curtains, every creaky board in the dusty basement beneath the stage, every wobbly plank at the dizzying height of the fly gallery, every rusty ventilation grate behind which hid the dark, tangled communications of the century-old building. Complex, as the circulatory system of an ancient leviathan. He even loved this night's silence, this opportunity to work calmly, without fuss and shouting supervisors, to assemble complex scenery for the new production. Check the winches, tighten the cables, replace burned-out bulbs in the spotlights. The work was hard, often thankless, poorly paid, but it was his life, his only real home, especially after Vanessa left him 6 months ago, taking their little daughter Emma, his laughing little girl. She left for another man, more successful, more promising. The theater remained the only place where Marcus felt needed, in demand, where everything was familiar, routine, and predictable. At least, that's how it seemed to him until this night. Tonight, he was alone. His young assistant, Ricky, a carefree joker and chatterbox, had asked to leave early. He had a date, first love, spring in November. Marcus just waved his hand dismissively. Youth. The scenery for the new ambitious production of Othello was complex, massive, multi-level, requiring precise, calibrated installation. Huge pseudo-Gothic arches imitating the vaults of a Venetian palace, heavy stone walls made of painted plywood and foam, dark, gnarled cypress trees that were supposed to move across the stage. All of this needed to be assembled, hung on the fly system, secured before the morning dress rehearsal. Marcus had been working for several hours straight, almost without a break, driven by deadlines and his ingrained habit of doing everything thoroughly, so that no one could find fault. He finished hanging the last massive arch, once again carefully checked all the fastenings, and began to descend via the steep metal ladder leading from the work catwalks to the stage. Below, on the huge empty stage, illuminated only by a couple of dim work lights, the scenery loomed, casting long, bizarre, distorted shadows, creating an atmosphere of unease, an anxious, phantom performance. Now I need to secure that crooked tree so it doesn't crash down on Desdemona at the most crucial moment, Marcus thought, heading toward the stage right wings where he'd left his heavy toolbox. And then he noticed the first strangeness, small, almost insignificant, but strange nonetheless. His adjustable wrench, his favorite old one, still from the 80s, with a comfortable handle, which he distinctly remembered leaving on top of the toolbox, now lay on the wooden stage floor next to the box. It hadn't just fallen, it lay neatly, parallel to the edge of the box, as if someone had picked it up, turned it over in their hands, and placed it nearby. Strange, Marcus muttered, picking up the wrench and looking around in confusion. Could there have been such a strong draft that it blew the heavy wrench off? Or maybe he just forgot where he put it. His memory wasn't what it used to be. Fatigue was taking its toll. It was 3 a.m. after all. He shrugged, trying not to attach importance to it, took the necessary fasteners from the box, a couple of clamps and a coil of wire, and went to the tree scenery. He fitted it to the floor, secured it reliably with guy wires, returned to the box for a hammer to drive in the wedges, and froze again. On the lid of the toolbox, where there had been nothing just a moment ago, lay his wrench, that same adjustable wrench. What the hell? Marcus felt unpleasant goosebumps run down his spine. This no longer looked like absent-mindedness. He distinctly remembered putting the wrench in the deep side pocket of his work jacket. He hurriedly patted his pocket empty. Okay, Marcus, calm down, no panic. Looks like you really need a vacation, or to go to sleep right here in the dressing room. You've been working yourself to death. Hallucinations are starting. He tried not to think about it, again attributing everything to extreme fatigue and distraction. But an unpleasant residue, a chill of anxiety, remained somewhere deep inside. He continued working, but now he kept looking around warily, listening to the silence that seemed to be becoming more and more tense, ringing. And the silence, it turned out, was no longer so dead and empty. He constantly imagined some sounds that he hadn't noticed before or hadn't paid attention to. A quiet rustling behind the curtains, as if someone was slowly and carefully moving heavy velvet fabric. But there was still no draft, he specifically checked. All doors and windows were tightly closed. A light, barely perceptible creak of floorboards on the stage, although he knew for certain he was alone. And a strange, dry, barely audible click or crunch coming from somewhere above, from the dark, dusty fly gallery, or from the wide ventilation grate above the front stage. The sound was short, sharp, similar to what a dislocated joint makes when it snaps back into place with effort. Rats, Marcus tried to calm himself again, although he understood that rats don't click their joints. Or just an old building living its own life, breathing, settling, creaking. Wooden structures dry out. He remembered old Joe, the night watchman, who loved to tell young stagehands scary stories about theater ghosts, about the White Lady, an actress who committed suicide and supposedly wandered through empty dressing rooms, about the headless violinist from the orchestra pit, about mysterious children's crying coming from the costume room. Marcus had always considered this nonsense, fantasies for impressionable young ladies or tipsy actors after a premiere. He didn't believe in ghosts, in mysticism, in devilry. He believed in physics, in the laws of nature, and in the reliability of safety cables. But now, alone at night in this huge, empty building full of shadows and strange sounds, his pragmatism and skepticism were beginning to crack. Something was wrong. The theater's atmosphere, with its century-long history, its accumulated energy, the energy of passions, tears, triumphs, failures, backstage intrigues, and perhaps something else, something dark and malevolent, was pressing down on him. He decided to take a break, drink some tea, get his thoughts in order. He sat on the edge of the stage, dangling his legs into the dark, bottomless void of the auditorium, sipped hot, sweet tea from his thermos. The warmth spread through his body, calmed his nerves somewhat. "All right, enough of this paranoia, Marcus," he said firmly to himself. "You're just tired. Now I'll finish this damn tree, check the cables one more time, and go home. To hell with perfectionism, I'll finish it in the morning." He got up to take the thermos back to the toolbox by the wings and froze again, growing cold. On the dusty stage floor, where he had just been sitting, was visible an imprint indistinct, blurred, as if left in haste, but quite distinguishable. The imprint of a bare foot or palm. He couldn't tell in the half-light, but the fingers were unnaturally long, thin, like those of a pianist or a spider. There were, he counted again, 6 of them, or so it seemed to him because of the blurriness. And the imprint itself was covered with strange gray, fine, almost weightless dust that shouldn't have been here on the relatively clean stage floor. Dust similar to what accumulates in ventilation shafts. Marcus felt his hair stand on end. He quickly, almost frantically, wiped away the imprint with his foot, smearing the gray dust across the dark boards. His heart began to pound like crazy. This was definitely not a rat, not a draft, and not his hallucinations. Someone was here, someone or something. Something with long fingers, leaving dusty tracks. He jerked his head up, sweeping the dark corners of the stage with the beam of his powerful flashlight, the heavy folds of the curtains, the empty portals, the velvet boxes, the darkening balcony. No one, only shadows and dust. He shone the light upward, at the fly gallery, at the tangle of work catwalks and cables under the very ceiling. And it seemed no. This time he was almost certain there on the highest, barely visible in the darkness gallery near the large ventilation grate. A shadow flickered long, thin, incredibly pale. A shadow that immediately slipped away and disappeared, as if it had been sucked inside the grate. "Hey, who's there? Come out," Marcus shouted so loudly that his voice cracked and echoed hollowly through the empty auditorium, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. "I know you're there. Come out immediately or I'm calling the police." The answer was silence, heavy, oppressive, ringing, hostile silence. "That's it, enough. Time to get out of here," he decided finally. To hell with the unfinished scenery, to hell with the morning rehearsal, to hell with possible fines or dismissal. Life and his own sanity were more important. He quickly gathered his tools in the box, not even closing it, grabbed his jacket and thermos, and hurried toward the service exit behind the wings that led to the inner courtyard. He almost ran through the echoing dark corridors, constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see that pale shadow behind him or hear that strange, dry clicking sound. He reached the heavy metal door of the service exit, pulled the handle, locked. Damn it, he had unlocked it himself from the inside when he came on shift. He searched his pocket for the key wasn't there. He searched all his pockets, jacket, pants, empty. The key had disappeared, the same key he had dropped on stage and never found. Someone had stolen it, or he had misplaced it somewhere and forgotten. Panic began to rise in his throat like an icy wave. Trapped in this huge, empty, terrifying building. It was here somewhere, and it was playing with him. It was mocking him. He pounded on the door with his fists, but the heavy metal only responded with a dull echo. Should he shout, call for help? But who would hear him? Old Joe was probably sleeping like a log in his cubbyhole, by the main entrance, in a completely different part of this gigantic building. And he'd hardly hear through the thick walls and the howling wind outside. He tried calling. He took out his mobile phone. As expected, no signal. The thick old walls of the theater, built back in the days when no one had heard of mobile communications, reliably shielded the signal. He was alone in a trap, with an unknown, invisible almost entity that moved through the ventilation, stole keys, left strange imprints, and apparently had no intention of letting him go. And then he heard it again, that quiet, dry click, very close, right behind him. Slowly, as if in slow motion, he turned around. At the end of the corridor, about 30 feet from him, under a dim emergency light, stood a figure tall, incredibly thin, pale, as if made of wax, porcelain, or rubber stretched over bones. It was dressed in something dark, form-fitting, almost merging with the walls, not restricting movement. Long, thin arms with unnaturally long fingers hung along its body, almost to its knees, and its face was smooth, white, expressionless, like that of a mannequin or an ancient statue, with dark hollows instead of eyes. The figure stood motionless and looked at him, or rather, Marcus felt that it was looking, although it had no eyes. It looked coldly, studyingly, without any emotions. Marcus froze, unable to move, unable to look away from this nightmarish, unnatural apparition. This wasn't a ghost. This was something material, physical, but absolutely wrong, alien. The figure swayed slightly, as if from a gust of wind that wasn't there, and slowly raised its arm. The fingers on the arm were incredibly long, flexible, without visible joints. They curved at completely impossible angles, like rubber, pointing at him. And then the figure took a step forward. The step was absolutely silent, smooth, gliding, as if it were floating above the floor. But in the next moment, its body began to deform, break, turn inside out. Arms twisted backwards at the elbows, folded behind its back. Legs bent at the knees, not backward but forward, like a grasshopper's. The head on the thin neck turned 180 degrees, then another 180, making a full revolution. The spine arched impossibly so that the head almost touched the heels, and the body folded in half. All this happened without a single sound, without visible effort, without the crunch of bones or muscle tension, with some kind of terrifying, inhuman, balletic grace. This was the contortionist, the creature from the ventilation, the embodiment of flexibility and pure, distilled horror. Marcus watched this grotesque, nauseating spectacle, and his brain refused to accept the reality of it. This couldn't be. This violated all laws of physics, anatomy, common sense. The contortionist, bent into an impossible, vomit-inducing pose, took another gliding, silent step toward him. And then its body, with the same smooth and flowing grace, began to straighten, returning to its original vertical position. And again, no sounds, no tension, only smooth, flowing, absolutely unnatural movements that made Marcus's hair stand on end all over his body. He realized that if he stayed here for another second, he would simply go mad with horror. He spun around and ran back into the depths of the theater, away from this nightmare, away from this embodiment of madness, anywhere, just not to see it behind him. He didn't hear the sound of pursuit, but he felt the cold, unblinking, inhuman attention directed at his back. It wasn't chasing him. It knew he was trapped. It was playing with him like a cat with a mouse, and it was clearly in no hurry. It had the whole night ahead, the whole night for this terrifying, perverted performance. Marcus ran through the endless echoing corridors behind the curtains, not knowing where, driven by pure animal terror. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, echoing in his ears. His lungs burned with fire from lack of air. The image of the contortionist, its impossible, nauseating contortions, its smooth, empty, mask-like face, all of this stood before his eyes, causing fits of nausea and dizziness. "What is it? What the hell is it?" pounded in his temples as he rushed through the dark passage, barely avoiding collision with walls and corners. A ghost, a demon, a mutant, an alien, a victim of a failed experiment. Or that same cursed circus contortionist from old Joe's legends. None of the explanations seemed suitable, didn't fit into his usual picture of the world based on logic and the laws of physics. This was something beyond understanding, something that violated the very foundations of reality, whose very essence was wrongness. He stopped at a familiar spiral staircase leading upward to the fly gallery. The complex, multi-level system of work catwalks, galleries, passages, and mechanisms under the very ceiling above the stage. His territory, the place he knew best in this huge building. Maybe there, at height, among the tangle of cables, beams, and spotlights, he would be safer. At least there were more escape routes and maneuvering room, more places to hide. And it was harder to get up there, although for a creature capable of squeezing through ventilation slots and moving with inhuman flexibility, height was hardly a serious obstacle. But he didn't see another way out for now. Quickly skipping steps, he climbed the steep metal staircase. Here, under the very ceiling of the theater, it was dark, dusty, and smelled of old, dried wood, machine oil from the winches, and omnipresent dust. The weak light of the work lamps from the stage barely penetrated here from below, creating a bizarre, phantasmagorical play of light and deep shadows. Under his feet were shaky wooden catwalks intertwined with thick steel cables, chains, electrical cables in thick braiding. Below, 60 feet under him, was the dark, bottomless abyss of the stage, with the scenery of Othello looming over it. One wrong move, one wrong step on a rotten board, and a long flight down to meet the hard stage floor. Marcus, despite years of working at height, had always been a little afraid of it, felt an unpleasant chill in his stomach standing on the edge. But now, the fear of the contortionist was incomparably stronger. He carefully moved along the central catwalk, lighting his way with a flashlight and carefully looking around. Here above, there were many secluded corners, niches behind the mechanisms of the winches, passages between levels of galleries, narrow crawls to the very beams under the roof. One could try to hide, disappear in this chaos of wood, metal, and dust. But he felt it knew where he was. The sensation of a cold, unblinking gaze didn't leave him, as if it were looking at him through walls, through darkness. He froze in the middle of the catwalk, listening. Silence, oppressive, tense silence, broken only by his own intermittent breathing and heartbeat, and a quiet click somewhere very close. He spun around sharply, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the tangle of beams and cables. No one. He shone the light down at the dark stage empty. He shone it up at the trusses under the very roof where pigeons nested, also no one. Click. Again, this time to his left, very close. He quickly directed the beam of his flashlight there and saw it. The contortionist was sitting on one of the thick wooden beams running parallel to the catwalk, just a couple of yards from him, sitting in a crouch, embracing the beam with its long, flexible legs bent at completely impossible angles. It sat motionless, like a pale Gothic gargoyle carved from ivory or plaster, and looked at him with its dark, empty hollows in its smooth, faceless visage. Marcus recoiled, almost losing his balance on the narrow catwalk. He quickly backed away, not taking his eyes off the creature. The contortionist didn't move, only slowly turned its head on its impossibly flexible neck, following him with its unblinking gaze. Marcus reached a wide work platform by the side wall, where the lighting control panel was located and several large spotlights on tripods. Here it was a little lighter. A work light was burning and seemed safer. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, trying to catch his breath and stop the trembling. What to do? Go down. But he might be waiting for a trap there too. Stay here. But it knew where he was and apparently had no intention of leaving. And then he heard a new sound, not a click this time, but a quiet, scratching, almost weightless rustle coming from the massive ventilation shaft, the grate of which was directly above the platform where he stood. Slowly, with horror, he raised his head. From the wide slots of the metal grate, fingers were slowly emerging, like white worms, long, thin, pale, without joints. They bent, feeling the space under the grate, and then an arm appeared from the grate, incredibly thin, flexible. It stretched down like a snake, reaching for him. Marcus recoiled in horror from the wall, almost falling off the platform. The arm darted down but didn't reach him. It felt around the wall, the control panel, then just as slowly, smoothly, retracted back into the dark interior of the ventilation shaft. He realized with final clarity that it could be anywhere above him, below him, behind the wall. It could appear at any moment from any crack, from any dark corner. He was trapped not only in the theater, but in the very geometry of space, which this thing distorted and violated with its presence. He needed to fight back. He couldn't just run and hide, but how and with what? He looked around. Nearby stood a heavy theatrical spotlight on a tripod, the kind used to create special effects. Maybe blind it with light. He remembered his previous experience. The light of his flashlight hadn't caused the creature any visible harm, but this spotlight was much more powerful. Maybe a concentrated, blinding beam could at least disorient it. He ran to the spotlight, found the switch on the housing, flicked it. The spotlight flared with a bright, narrow beam of light like a blade. Marcus directed it toward where he had seen the contortionist on the beam. The figure had disappeared as if it had never been there. But a second later, Marcus heard a click behind him, by the staircase he had climbed. He spun around sharply, directing the beam of the spotlight there. The contortionist stood on the top step of the staircase, where thick shadow had been just a moment before. It stood motionless, and the beam of the spotlight seemed to cause it no harm, only making its pale figure even more contrasted against the darkness. The light was indifferent to it. It slowly moved toward him along the catwalks. Its body began to contort again, taking on unnatural, grotesque poses. Arms stretched forward, fingerless joints curled like the claws of a predatory bird. It walked toward him slowly but inexorably. Marcus retreated, backing along the shaky catwalk, dragging the heavy spotlight on the tripod behind him. He understood that fighting it here, at height, in these narrow passages, was useless and deadly dangerous. He needed to get down to the open space of the stage. But how? The staircase was behind the creature. To jump from a 60-foot height was certain death. He looked down at the dark stage. There, beneath him, hung the heavy scenery of Othello on cables. A system of ropes and counterweights, winches, control levers. He knew this system like the back of his hand. If he could reach the levers controlling the main curtain or the fire curtain. He rushed toward the other edge of the catwalks, where the main control platform for the mechanical stage was located, with rows of levers and buttons. The contortionist followed him. Its movements became faster and more agile, as if it understood his plan or was simply tired of playing. It glided along the catwalks, bending, crawling between cables and beams with incredible spider-like speed. Marcus reached the control platform, grabbed one of the largest levers, the one responsible for raising and lowering the main heavy velvet curtain. He pulled the lever toward himself. The mechanism came into motion with a creak. The huge curtain on the stage below slowly crawled upward. The contortionist was already nearby. It made a long, incredible, almost impossible jump across the gap between the catwalks and landed on the control platform right in front of Marcus, blocking his path of retreat. Its body instantly contorted, arms stretched out like snakes, trying to grab him. Marcus acted instinctively, almost without thinking. He lowered the curtain lever and kicked another, smaller lever next to it, the one responsible for the emergency release of the counterweight, of one of the heaviest pieces of scenery, that same stone castle wall. There was a deafening crash and the screech of metal. The huge cast-iron counterweight block broke free from its place above the platform and plummeted down with terrifying speed, dragging the thick steel cable with it. The cable whipped across the platform, across the contortionist's legs, nearly knocking Marcus off his feet as well. The contortionist, it didn't have time to dodge, or its flexibility didn't help it. The heavy cable struck it in the legs with force, breaking them or dislocating them in unnatural places. It let out a piercing but soundless scream, or so it seemed to Marcus in the roar of the falling counterweight. Its body lost balance, and it tumbled, somersaulting and contorting in the air in impossible poses, and fell down into the dark abyss of the stage. Marcus ran to the edge of the platform and looked down. The contortionist's body lay on the dusty stage floor, motionless, a white spot in the gloom. Its long limbs spread at completely unnatural, broken angles. Had he killed it or just broken it? Could such a thing even die from a fall, or had it simply shattered from the impact? He didn't wait for an answer. He rushed to the staircase and began to descend quickly, almost at a run. He needed to get out of this damned theater as quickly as possible, before it woke up, recovered, reassembled itself, or before another one like it appeared. He descended to the stage, trying not to look at the motionless white body of the contortionist lying at the foot of the scenery. He ran to the service exit. The door, it was open, and his key was sticking out of the lock from the outside. Had it opened the door itself and left the key? Why, so he could leave. Or was this another game, another trap? He didn't stop to think. He turned the key, opened the door, burst outside into the cold, damp pre-dawn New Orleans night, and ran away from the theater, not looking back, not stopping. He ran until he was out of breath. He stopped on a deserted street corner near the dark, motionless Mississippi River. He breathed heavily, looked at his reflection in a shop window. He had survived, escaped, but at what cost, and what had it been? He looked at his hands, they were trembling. And it seemed to him, or not, that his fingers had become a little longer, a little thinner. And the joints, they moved somehow more freely than usual. With fear, almost not believing himself, he tried to bend his index finger in the opposite direction. The finger yielded easily, without pain, a little further than usual, with a quiet, barely audible click. "No," he whispered, jerking his hand away as if from a snake. "No, it just seemed that way, just nerves." But he knew that this night would leave an indelible scar not only on his body. He had probably given himself bruises and scrapes during the chase, but also on his soul. He would never be able to forget the contortionist, its impossible, nauseating contortions, its empty, faceless visage. And he would never again be able to feel calm in the silence and darkness of old buildings, because it would always seem to him that from the darkness of a ventilation grate, someone was watching him, that in the shadow around the corner, someone was silently and flexibly contorting, that the creature from the ventilation was waiting for its moment, waiting for him. Marcus returned home only in the morning, devastated, broken, dirty. He took a scalding hot shower, stood under the streams of water for a long time, trying to wash off not only the dirt and dust of the old theater, but also the sticky, cold horror of the night he had lived through. Then he took out his stash from the bar, an almost full bottle of bourbon, and drank almost half of it in one gulp. But alcohol brought neither oblivion nor calm, only intensified the throbbing headache and nausea. He collapsed on the bed fully clothed, and fell into a heavy, endless, troubled sleep full of nightmares. He dreamed of endless dark ventilation shafts from which empty hollows looked at him, and he dreamed of pale limbs contorting at impossible angles, entangling him, strangling him. He dreamed of that quiet, dry click of dislocating joints, his own joints. He woke up in the afternoon, closer to evening, with a feeling of complete exhaustion, as if he had been beaten with sticks all night. His body hurt unbearably, every muscle ached, every joint ached. He got up from bed with difficulty and went to the mirror in the bathroom. What he saw made him grow cold with horror. Pale, with dark circles under his eyes, haggard, this was expected. But the most terrible thing wasn't this. He hadn't imagined it that night. His fingers, they really had become thinner and somehow a little longer. And the skin on his hands was pale and smooth, almost poreless, like wax. And the joints, they looked somehow different, too flexible, too free. With fear, almost not believing himself, he again tried to bend his index finger in the opposite direction. The finger easily, without the slightest pain, bent almost at a right angle, with a quiet, barely audible dry click. "No, this can't be, he whispered, jerking his hand away as if from fire and looking at it with horror and disgust. This was just stretching, overstrain of ligaments, or nervous psychosomatics. He tried to convince himself that all this seemed to him, that these were the consequences of the shock he had experienced, stress, overwork, alcohol, that everything would pass. But doubts, cold and sticky like the contortionist's fingers, gnawed at him from within. What if that touch of the creature in that last second on the catwalks hadn't passed without a trace? What if he had been infected, not with a disease, but with something worse, had taken on part of its nature, its flexibility, its essence? He spent several days at home as if in a fog, trying to come to his senses and comprehend what had happened. He turned off his phone so he wouldn't have to answer calls from work. They were probably already looking for him because of the disrupted rehearsal and abandoned scenery. He didn't communicate with anyone, tried not to think about the theater, about the contortionist, about his hands. But the nightmares continued every night, and the joints, they really had become somehow more flexible, mobile. Now Marcus could easily reach the floor with his palms without bending his knees, which he hadn't been able to do since school. He could turn his head almost 180 degrees, looking behind him. He could turn his elbow in the opposite direction. These new, frightening abilities appeared gradually, but inexorably, and were accompanied by quiet, dry clicks in his bones. He decided to search for information on the internet. Again and again, he entered the most insane queries in the search engine. Person with flexible joints, disease of turning bones, unnatural flexibility after stress, theater curse, creature from ventilation, snake person, circus fire. The results were all equally discouraging. Either dry medical articles about rare genetic diseases of connective tissue like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or Marfan syndrome. But he hadn't had such syndromes from birth, or urban legends, horror stories from dubious forums and esoteric sites. Nothing similar to what was happening to him. In one of the old, yellowed newspaper clippings found on a local historian's site, he came across a more detailed mention of the old Meridian Vaudeville Theater that had burned down on the site of the current Crescent Theater in the early 20th century, and of its main star, Monsieur Flexer, famous throughout America as the human serpent, whose flexibility and contortions amazed and simultaneously frightened the public. They said his abilities were inhuman, that he had made a deal with the devil, or was a member of some secret society practicing forbidden rituals to change the body, and that he died a terrible death in the fire, tangled in his own limbs under the collapsing structures, and before his death cursed this place and all who would come here after him. The article had attached an old, blurry photograph, a man in a tight leotard, bent in an impossible pose. The initials under the photo, MF, exactly the same as on the silver cufflink that Marcus had found in the ventilation shaft. So that's it, Marcus grew cold. The contortionist is the circus performer, his ghost or his curse that has taken form, and now it has passed to me. This thought was unbearable. He didn't want to be like that. He didn't want this terrible, unnatural flexibility. He wanted to be normal, to return his former life, his Vanessa, his Emma. These thoughts gave him no peace. He understood that he had to return to the theater. Not to work, no, he could no longer work there. He had to return to find answers, to understand what was happening to him, whether this could be stopped, whether he could get rid of this curse, or whether he could help that suffering soul trapped in the contortionist's body. He waited for night. His heart was pounding so hard it seemed it would jump out of his chest. But this time fear was mixed with some strange, morbid determination, almost obsession. He entered the main building. Silence, dust, the smell of antiquity and oblivion. He walked through the familiar corridors, went up to the second floor, then to the stage. The theater world greeted him with silence and shadows. The contortionist's body wasn't on the stage. Only a few dark, oily stains on the dusty floor, and a scattering of gray, weightless dust remained. It had disappeared, evaporated, or had never been truly material. Or it had simply gone away, back to its lair in the ventilation, to lick its wounds and wait for a new meeting. Marcus felt simultaneously relief and a new wave of fear. So he hadn't defeated it then, had only frightened, angered, or forced it to retreat. He decided to check the ventilation. Maybe the contortionist was there again. He climbed back up to the fly gallery, to those same work catwalks where their battle had taken place. He reached the ventilation grate from which he had seen the creature's arm. He looked inside, shining his flashlight. Darkness, thick dust, cobwebs. The cufflink, that same silver cufflink with the monogram, MF, was still lying there at the bottom of the shaft, dimly gleaming in the beam of light. He hooked it with a pole and pulled it out, clenched it in his fist. The cold metal seemed to pulse with some inner life, and then he heard the sound, that quiet, dry click, very close, right behind him. He turned around sharply. On the catwalks, a few steps away from him, stood the contortionist, pale, thin, impassive. It looked at Marcus with its dark hollows, looked not with anger, not threateningly, but rather with curiosity and expectation. Marcus recoiled instinctively, holding the pole with the hook like a spear in front of him. But the contortionist didn't attack. It slowly, smoothly raised its long, flexible arm and pointed with its jointless finger at Marcus himself, at his chest, where his heart should be under his clothes. And then its body began to change again. It became more transparent, blurred, like a figure in fog. And through it, as if on an old, faded photograph, the outlines of another person began to show through. A young, handsome man with fine facial features and sad eyes, dressed in an old-fashioned embroidered stage costume of a contortionist performer. The man was writhing in unbearable pain, His face was distorted with a grimace of suffering. He was silently screaming, breaking invisible bars, trying to break free from the pale, flexible shell of the contortionist that enveloped him like a cocoon, like a soul from a prison. Marcus watched this incredible, heart-rending vision, his heart squeezed with sympathy. He understood the contortionist wasn't a monster. It was a prison, a cursed shell in which the suffering soul of that circus performer, Monsieur Flexer, or someone else who had become a victim of this place's curse, had been trapped for over a century. The vision disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Before him again stood the impassive, pale, empty contortionist. It took a step forward, then another. It approached, but now there was no threat in its approach, rather a silent plea, a request for liberation. What did it need? For Marcus to help it. But how? Destroy this shell, break the prison. But how to do it without harming the soul inside? And what would happen if the soul was freed? Would it become a vengeful ghost haunting the theater, or would it finally find peace and leave? The contortionist came very close, almost touching. It extended its pale, flexible arm and again touched Marcus's hand, the same hand whose joints were beginning to acquire unnatural, frightening flexibility. The contortionist again slowly pointed at its chest, and then at Marcus. It was offering what? To change places. To enter it, become it. Free the suffering soul by taking its place in this flexible, eternal prison of pain and loneliness. To become the new contortionist, the new guardian of this theater. Marcus recoiled as if struck. No, this was madness. He didn't want such a fate. He wanted to live a normal life, returned Vanessa, Emma. The contortionist slowly lowered its arm. In its dark hollows, something flickered that resembled deep, infinite disappointment, sadness. And then it did what Marcus never expected. It turned around smoothly, soundlessly, and with its slow, gliding gait, walked away along the catwalks. It reached the ventilation grate easily, like a snake, without any effort, squeezed into it, and disappeared into the dark, dusty depths of the shaft. Marcus remained alone on the high, empty fly gallery, trembling all over. What had that been an offer, a temptation, a warning, or just a game of sick imagination provoked by horror and loneliness? He didn't know. He went down to the stage, left the theater, even taking the found cufflink with him. Again alive, again free. But something had changed in him irreversibly, forever. He no longer feared his newly acquired flexibility. He didn't try to hide it or cure it. He accepted it as part of himself, as a strange, terrible, but undeniable reminder of that night, of the contortionist, of the suffering soul trapped in someone else's distorted body. Days passed, then weeks. Marcus tried to return to normal life, but it was no longer the same. The flexibility continued to develop. Now he could bend his body in ways that defied anatomy, could squeeze through impossibly narrow spaces, could move with an eerie, fluid grace that attracted stares and whispers. He quit his job at the theater. He couldn't bear to return there every day, knowing what lurked in the shadows. He tried to reconnect with Vanessa, to explain without sounding insane. But how do you tell someone that you've been touched by something beyond the natural world? She noticed the changes in him immediately, not just the physical ones, but something deeper. There was a haunted quality to his eyes now, a way he moved that was too smooth, too fluid. She pulled Emma closer to her when he visited, and Marcus saw the fear in both their faces. One night, alone in his apartment, Marcus stood before the bathroom mirror, practicing the movements that came so naturally now. His spine curved in impossible arcs, his limbs bent at angles that should have broken bones. And with each movement came that soft, dry click, the sound of joints that no longer followed human limitations. He thought of the trapped soul in the theater, of Monsieur Flexer writhing in his eternal prison. Was this his fate too? To slowly lose his humanity, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the curse. The silver cufflink lay on his dresser, catching moonlight from the window. Sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear it whispering not words, but something older than language, a sound like wind through empty spaces, like the settling of old bones. Marcus picked up the cufflink, feeling its cold weight. He had a choice to make. He could fight this transformation, seek help, try to find some way to break the curse. Or he could accept it, embrace what he was becoming, and perhaps find a way to free the soul that had been trapped for so long. Outside his window, New Orleans slept fitfully under a blanket of humid darkness. Somewhere across the city, the Crescent Theater stood empty and waiting, its ventilation shafts echoing with sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. Marcus closed his eyes and felt his body shift, joints clicking softly as he assumed a position that would have been impossible for any normal human being. When he opened his eyes again, his reflection in the mirror looked back with an expression that was no longer entirely his own. The transformation was accelerating. Soon, he would have to make his choice fight for his humanity, or surrender to the curse and perhaps, in doing so, find a way to break the cycle that had held Monsieur Flexer prisoner for over a century. The cufflink grew warm in his palm, and Marcus thought he heard, faintly, the sound of distant applause, the kind that would have filled a vaudeville theater long ago. When a man called Flexer bent his body into impossible shapes for the gasps and cheers of an amazed crowd. But applause, Marcus now knew, could be its own kind of prison. The night stretched on, full of possibilities and terrors in equal measure. And in the Crescent Theater, something waited patiently in the darkness of the ventilation shafts, knowing that the cycle would continue, that the curse would claim another soul, or perhaps, just perhaps, find its long-awaited end. Marcus set the cufflink down and began to plan his return to the theater, knowing that this time he might not leave the same way he entered. The contortionist had made its offer, and Marcus was beginning to understand that some offers once made could not be ignored forever. The transformation was no longer something happening to him. It was something he was choosing, step by flexible step, click by impossible click. And in that choice lay either his doom or his salvation, and perhaps the salvation of the tortured soul that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.